The impossible box. What container holds the most precious treasures yet can never be opened by human hands? Our minds create these puzzles that torment us as we drift towards sleep. Consider the enigma of consciousness itself, a box without hinges that somehow contains your entire world. Scientists have studied the brain for centuries, mapping neurons and pathways, yet the essence of awareness remains locked away. How does gray matter create the vivid experience of being? Some philosophers argue consciousness is merely an illusion, a story we tell ourselves. Others believe it's fundamental to reality itself. Perhaps the answer exists in quantum mechanics, where observation mysteriously affects reality. Or maybe consciousness emerges from complexity, just as wetness emerges from water molecules. As you drift toward sleep, remember that you carry within you the greatest unsolved mystery. The impossible box of consciousness that holds your every thought, memory, and dream, yet cannot be opened to reveal its secret mechanism. The vanishing footprints. The detective stands puzzled in the empty room. Footprints lead in but not out, a classic locked room mystery. In our own lives, we encounter these impossible scenarios more often than we realize. Consider the riddle of quantum particles that seem to vanish and reappear without traveling through intervening space. Quantum tunneling allows particles to mysteriously traverse barriers they shouldn't have enough energy to cross. Like the vanishing suspect, the particle disappears from one location and appears in another without leaving footprints between. Neurologically, we experience similar gaps in consciousness. Your awareness blinks thousands of times daily. Microsleep states where your consciousness temporarily vanishes. During deep sleep, where does your awareness go? It leaves no footprints, no trail to follow. The sense of self that seems so solid during waking hours simply vanishes, only to reappear with morning light. As you lie here preparing for sleep, your consciousness is about to perform its own vanishing act, stepping into a room from which no footprints will emerge until dawn. The infinite library. Imagine a library containing every possible book, every combination of letters that could ever exist. Somewhere in this collection lies the complete and accurate history of your life, including tomorrow. Yet for every true volume, countless false ones exist with tiny, misleading variations. Jorge Luis Borges described such a place in The Library of Babel, a perfect metaphor for our information age. With infinite content available, how do we distinguish truth from falsehood? Consider social media, a real-world infinite library where accurate information mingles freely with deception. Our brains, evolved for a simpler world, struggle with this overload. The paradox deepens when we consider self-referential knowledge. If a book states, "This library contains at least one false book," is that statement itself true or false? Similar paradoxes plague mathematics and logic. Gödel's incompleteness. Theorems prove that any consistent mathematical system must contain unprovable truths, statements that are correct but impossible to verify within the system. As your mind drifts towards sleep, consider that perhaps some truths about consciousness itself might be fundamentally unprovable from within consciousness. The paradoxical barber. In a village lives a barber who shaves everyone who doesn't shave themselves, and no one else. Who shaves the barber? This self-referential paradox, first proposed by Bertrand Russell, reveals the limits of language and logic. If the barber shaves himself, then by definition, he doesn't shave himself. If he doesn't shave himself, then by definition, he must shave himself. No solution exists. Similar paradoxes appear throughout mathematics and philosophy. Consider the set of all sets that don't contain themselves. Does this set contain itself? Either answer leads to contradiction. Our minds crave consistency, yet reality sometimes refuses to provide it. Quantum mechanics embraces this paradoxical nature, with particles existing in multiple states simultaneously until observed. Even consciousness contains its own paradoxes. How can the mind study itself objectively? The observer and the observed are the same entity. As you prepare for sleep, your conscious mind will soon surrender to unconsciousness, unable to witness its own transition. The barber cannot resolve his paradox, and perhaps neither can we resolve the fundamental paradoxes of existence. The unbreakable clock. What timepiece needs no winding, yet always shows the correct time? Consider the sun, nature's original clock, marking time since before humans existed to measure it. Yet even this cosmic timekeeper isn't perfect. Earth's rotation gradually slows, making days incrementally longer across geological time. Our perception of time itself presents an even greater mystery. Why does time always flow forward? Physics doesn't require this direction. Most equations work equally well, forward or backward. The answer may lie in entropy, the universe's tendency toward disorder. But this raises another question. Why was entropy so low in the early universe? Time perception also varies subjectively. In danger, seconds stretch to minutes as your brain processes information more intensively. During sleep, hours compress to moments. Einstein recognized that time dilates physically under conditions of extreme gravity or velocity. A clock in orbit runs slightly faster than one on Earth. Perhaps most puzzling is how consciousness creates the experience of now, a present moment that somehow feels different from past and future. As you drift toward sleep, your perception of time will soon shift, and hours will pass in what feels like moments. The endless corridor. A corridor extends before you with 100 light switches. Each controls one bulb in a distant room. You must walk the corridor repeatedly, following a precise pattern of switching. This methodical process mirrors mathematics' search for patterns in apparent chaos. The specific puzzle asks which lights remain on after following a specific switching sequence. The answer lies in number theory. Only bulbs with perfect square-numbered positions, 1, 4, 9, 16, remain lit. Why? Each factor of a number represents one toggling of its switch. Numbers with an odd number of factors end up on, and only perfect squares have an odd number of factors. Such elegant patterns hide everywhere in nature. Consider the Fibonacci sequence appearing in flower petals and pine cones, or how complex snowflakes emerge from simple hexagonal symmetry. Our brains evolved to detect patterns, sometimes finding them even where none exist. This pareidolia explains why we see faces in clouds or hear messages in random noise. As you prepare for sleep, your brain continues searching for patterns, organizing the day's experiences into meaningful narratives. This pattern seeking continues even in dreams, creating stories from random neural firing. The shadowed twin. Something follows you faithfully throughout the day, stretching and shrinking with the sun's movement, yet vanishes when darkness falls. What could be more familiar, yet more mysterious than your own shadow? Though we understand the physics perfectly, light traveling in straight lines, blocked by opaque objects, shadows still carry psychological weight. Carl Jung proposed that each person has a psychological shadow, aspects of ourselves we repress or deny. This shadow self contains qualities we refuse to acknowledge, both negative and positive potential we've rejected. Like physical shadows, our psychological shadows are always with us, yet often go unnoticed. Quantum physics gives us another perspective on shadows. The quantum wave function collapses upon observation, leaving only one reality from many possibilities. The unmanifested possibilities become shadows of what might have been. Even our decisions create shadows, paths not taken that sometimes haunt us with what-if questions. As you prepare for sleep, your consciousness will soon recede, and your unconscious mind, your psychological shadow, will take center stage in dreams. The impossible rope. Two identical ropes burn inconsistently, each taking exactly 1 hour to burn completely. How can you measure precisely 45 minutes with no other tools? This puzzle forces us to think beyond conventional measurement. The solution requires lighting the first rope at both ends, while simultaneously lighting one end of the second rope. When the first rope burns completely, after 30 minutes, light the other end of the second rope. The second rope, half consumed, will burn its remaining quarter in 15 minutes, giving you exactly 45 minutes total. This illustrates how complex problems often require looking at resources differently. Nature solves similar problems through evolution. Consider how bombardier beetles create explosive defensive sprays by combining chemicals that react instantly when needed, or how certain fungi can tell time to release spores at optimal moments. Time itself presents measurement challenges beyond ordinary ropes. Relativity shows that time flows differently depending on gravity and velocity. At the quantum level, time measurement becomes even stranger. Particles can apparently influence each other instantaneously across any distance, challenging our understanding of temporal sequence. As you prepare for sleep, your perception of time will soon shift dramatically. 8 hours passing subjectively in what might feel like moments. The last word. Words contain magic. They can change their own meaning through simple manipulation. Consider the riddle. What 5-letter word becomes shorter when you add 2 letters to it? The answer is short. We add to make shorter. This wordplay reveals language's self-referential nature. Words about words create fascinating paradoxes. The word polysyllabic describes itself, while monosyllabic contradicts itself. Similarly, non-self-descriptive creates a paradox when we ask if it describes itself. These linguistic puzzles mirror deeper philosophical questions about self-reference. Consciousness observing itself creates similar logical loops. When you think about thinking, who is doing the thinking about the thinking? This recursive nature of awareness creates the illusion of an infinite regression, like 2 mirrors facing each other. Hofstadter called this the strange loop of consciousness. Somehow, the system refers back to itself while creating something greater than its parts. Language evolved as a tool for communication, but developed these fascinating self-referential properties. As you drift toward sleep, your language centers will gradually quiet, yet awareness persists in non-verbal forms until consciousness itself fades into dreams. The unsolvable equation. Can you find a value where x equals 1 minus x? The riddle seems straightforward, but leads us into mathematical territory where certainty dissolves. Setting up the equation, x equals 1 minus x. Rearranging, 2x equals 1. Therefore, x equals 1/2. Simple, yet profound. This modest equation demonstrates perfect balance, a mathematical equilibrium where a value equals what remains when subtracted from unity. Nature seeks similar equilibria, from predator-prey relationships to chemical reactions. Consider market economies that theoretically balance through invisible hands, or ecological systems maintaining homeostasis through countless interactions. Even consciousness might represent an equilibrium state, the brain balancing excitation and inhibition to maintain awareness. Beyond simple equations lie truly unsolvable mathematical problems. Some equations have no analytical solutions, requiring numerical approximation. Others, like the halting problem in computer science, are provably unsolvable. Certain mathematical questions aren't just unanswered, they're fundamentally unanswerable within their systems. This connects to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, proving that any consistent mathematical system must contain true statements that cannot be proven within that system. As your mind relaxes toward sleep, remember that not every question has an answer, and perhaps the deepest mysteries of consciousness are fundamentally unanswerable from within consciousness itself. The empty room. 3 people enter an empty room and lock the door. Later, 5 people are found inside. How can this be possible? The conventional answer involves semantics. 2 of the 3 were pregnant, later giving birth. But this riddle invites deeper contemplation about existence and identity. When does a person become a person? Various traditions place this moment differently, at conception, viability, birth, or even later. Consciousness itself presents a similar conundrum. When does awareness begin in development? Infants demonstrate basic consciousness, but when exactly does it emerge? This connects to philosophical questions about personal identity. If consciousness is what makes us who we are, how do we account for its daily disappearance during deep sleep? We accept that we remain the same person despite this regular discontinuity. Even more puzzling, our physical bodies replace most cells over time, yet we perceive ourselves as continuous entities. Like the people appearing in the locked room, consciousness itself seems to emerge mysteriously from neural activity, with no clear explanation for how physical processes generate subjective experience. As you prepare for sleep, your own consciousness will soon temporarily vanish, only to reappear hours later with the impression of continuous identity. The forgotten name. Pronounced as one letter, written with 3 letters, and present in all mammals. This riddle's answer is I. This elegant wordplay highlights how language creates multiple layers of meaning. The I itself presents profound mysteries beyond its name. Vision involves light conversion to electrochemical signals, but how these signals become conscious experience remains unknown. The hard problem of consciousness asks how physical processes create subjective experiences like seeing color. Even more fascinating is how vision constructs reality rather than passively receiving it. Your brain fills in your blind spot automatically. It corrects color based on context. It interprets 2-dimensional retinal images as 3-dimensional reality. Much of what you see is actually constructed by your brain. Beyond physical vision lies the mind's eye, our ability to visualize internally without external input. This capacity varies tremendously between individuals, with some people, aphantasics, reporting no visual imagery whatsoever. As you prepare for sleep, your eyes will close, yet visual experience continues in dreams, creating immersive worlds entirely within your mind. Like the riddle's different levels of meaning, vision operates simultaneously on physical, neurological, and phenomenological levels, each with its own mysteries. The heaviest feather. Which weighs more, a pound of feathers or a pound of gold? The riddle seems deceptively simple until you realize gold is traditionally weighed using troy pounds, 12 ounces, while feathers use avoirdupois pounds, 16 ounces. Though both are called pounds, a pound of feathers actually outweighs a pound of gold. This illustrates how even seemingly objective measurements can hide cultural assumptions. Our perceptions contain similar hidden assumptions. Consider how we perceive weight itself. It's not actually a property of objects, but a force resulting from gravitational attraction. In zero gravity, both feathers and gold would be weightless. Yet our Earth-evolved brains automatically interpret weight as an intrinsic property of objects. This exemplifies how our perceptions are shaped by evolutionary history. Similarly, color doesn't exist objectively. Only wavelengths of light exist, with color being our brain's interpretation. The blue you see might be entirely different from the blue someone else experiences, with no way to compare subjective experiences. As you prepare for sleep, consider how many of your perceptions that seem objectively real might actually be mental constructions based on evolutionary and cultural programming, as arbitrary as the different definitions of pound that make this riddle work. The underwater fire. What burns in water? This paradoxical question has several answers. Sodium metal reacts violently with water, seemingly burning, though the reaction differs from combustion. Underwater thermal vents reach temperatures exceeding 700 degrees Fahrenheit, while certain chemical flames can indeed burn underwater with their own oxidizers. Beyond literal interpretations, this riddle invites us to consider opposing forces coexisting. Eastern philosophies embrace such paradoxes, as in the yin-yang symbol where opposites contain elements of each other. Quantum physics similarly discovers particles existing as both waves and particles simultaneously. Consciousness itself embodies paradox. Somehow both physical, brain-based, and non-physical, subjective experience. Neuroscience identifies neural correlates of consciousness, yet cannot explain how electrochemical activity transforms into subjective experience. Like fire underwater, this coexistence seems impossible, yet demonstrably occurs. Our minds contain similar contradictions: rational thought alongside emotion, selfishness alongside altruism. Dreams particularly embody paradox, creating experiences that feel real despite their impossibility. As you drift towards sleep, your consciousness will soon transition to this paradoxical dream state, where impossibilities like underwater fires become momentarily plausible in your personal experience. The upside-down mountain. What grows shorter as it ages? The conventional answer is a candle, though many things follow this pattern. Birthday candles, pencils, soap bars, and indeed, human lives as we shrink slightly with age. This inversion of expected patterns appears throughout nature. Stars begin enormous but collapse as they age. Universes theoretically expand from infinitesimal points to vast expanses, potentially to contract again. Even time itself might eventually reverse, according to some cosmological models. In consciousness, we find similar inversions. As infants, our subjective experience is expansive but undifferentiated. Growing up narrows our perception, focusing consciousness but potentially diminishing its breadth. Meditation practitioners often report experiences of expanding awareness by reducing focused thought. Another inversion. The brain presents its own upside-down mountain, with neural pathways proliferating wildly in infancy before pruning unnecessary connections. This counterintuitive process actually enables more sophisticated cognition. Sleep itself represents another inversion. By suspending consciousness, we ultimately enhance it, as sleep deprivation severely impairs cognitive function. As you prepare to sleep, your brain will soon invert its normal functioning, shutting down executive networks while activating other regions to consolidate memories and restore neural function. The persistent shadow. What's always ahead of you yet can't be seen? The conventional answer is the future, though tomorrow also fits. This riddle captures the peculiar nature of time, perpetually approaching yet never quite arriving. The future influences our present actions yet doesn't technically exist. Physics complicates this picture further. Einstein's relativity eliminated the concept of universal present moments, showing that simultaneity depends on the observer's reference frame. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest the future might partially determine the past through backward causation. The delayed choice quantum eraser experiment implies a measurement in the future can seemingly affect a particle's behavior in the past. Consciousness itself has a complex relationship with time. We experience now as special, yet neuroscience reveals that our sense of now actually lags behind reality by hundreds of milliseconds. Our brains create the illusion of continuous, immediate perception by retroactively organizing neural signals that arrive at different speeds. Dreams distort time even more dramatically, sometimes compressing or expanding it beyond recognition. As your consciousness fades into sleep, your perception of time will shift dramatically, with hours passing subjectively in what might feel like minutes, demonstrating how malleable our experience of time truly is. The immortal butterfly. What flies without wings? Time flies, ideas fly, rumors fly, colors fly from flags, tempers fly in arguments. This riddle reminds us how metaphor permeates language, transferring physical concepts to abstract domains. Our thinking relies fundamentally on such metaphorical structures. We speak of grasping ideas, seeing truths, and running out of patience. These aren't mere figures of speech, but reveal how abstract thinking builds upon physical experience. Cognitive linguists like Lakoff and Johnson argue that metaphor isn't just linguistic ornamentation, but forms the foundation of conceptual thought. Even mathematics, seemingly pure abstraction, relies on metaphorical understanding. We add to collections and divide continuous quantities. Consciousness itself eludes direct description, forcing us to employ metaphors like stream of consciousness or spotlight of attention. These metaphors shape how we conceptualize our own awareness. Some Eastern traditions use the butterfly as a metaphor for consciousness itself, delicate, transformative, and perhaps illusory. Zhuangzi famously questioned whether he was a man dreaming of being a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming of being a man. As you drift toward sleep, your consciousness will soon transform into the paradoxical awareness of dreams, where the boundaries between reality and imagination dissolve. The final breath. The person who makes it doesn't want it. The person who buys it doesn't use it. The person who uses it doesn't know it. What is it? A coffin presents this morbid riddle's traditional answer. This contemplation of mortality reminds us of consciousness's strangest feature, its inevitable termination. Death presents the ultimate cognitive paradox. We can conceptualize our own non-existence, yet cannot truly imagine it experientially. As Epicurus noted, where death is, I am not. Where I am, death is not. This inability to truly conceive of our own non-existence may explain humanity's persistent belief in afterlives across cultures. Neuroscience offers fascinating insights into near-death experiences, often involving tunnels of light, life reviews, and profound peace. These remarkably consistent experiences may result from specific brain processes during oxygen deprivation. Others suggest they might represent glimpses of consciousness beyond physical existence. Sleep shares intriguing parallels with death. Greeks called hypnos, sleep, and thanatos, death, brothers. Both involve surrender of conscious control. Both were feared yet inevitable. Yet unlike death, sleep promises return. As you transition to sleep, you practice a small surrender of consciousness, a temporary cessation of self-awareness that somehow feels both unsettling and deeply necessary. The soundless echo. What question can never truthfully be answered yes? The answer, are you asleep? The moment you answer, you're awake. This paradox highlights consciousness's self-referential nature. Many states of consciousness preclude their own observation. Deep sleep, by definition, cannot be experienced consciously. The observer would disrupt the state being observed. Similar paradoxes appear throughout science. Quantum physics demonstrates that observation itself changes systems. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle shows we cannot simultaneously know a particle's position and momentum with perfect accuracy. The act of measuring disrupts what's being measured. Consciousness studies face this observer effect acutely. Introspection alters the mental states being examined. When you try to observe your own thinking process, that very observation becomes part of the process, changing what you're attempting to study. Dream researchers encounter similar challenges. Lucid dreaming, becoming aware you're dreaming while remaining in the dream, fundamentally transforms the dream state. The very awareness of dreaming changes the experience. Some contemplative traditions embrace this paradox, cultivating meta-awareness during various states of consciousness. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll briefly notice the transition state between wakefulness and slumber, though full awareness would prevent the very sleep you're observing. The invisible path. I have cities without houses, forests without trees, and rivers without water. What am I? A map represents the answer, a representation that omits most details of what it represents. Maps demonstrate how abstraction creates understanding through strategic omission. This parallels how consciousness functions, not by processing all available information, but by filtering most of it out. Your brain receives millions of sensory inputs simultaneously, but brings only a tiny fraction to awareness. Without this filtering, consciousness would be overwhelmed by raw sensation. Memory operates similarly, storing simplified representations rather than complete experiences. When recalling events, you remember highlights and patterns, not exhaustive details. This selective representation enables understanding by reducing complexity to manageable models. Scientists use this principle when creating theories, deliberate simplifications that capture essential features while omitting complications. However, all representations have limitations. Just as maps distort reality through projection, transforming a sphere onto a flat surface, our mental models inevitably distort what they represent. Our perception isn't a direct window onto reality, but a constructed model optimized for survival, not accuracy. As you prepare for sleep, your consciousness will transition to dream states where your brain creates even more abstract representations, symbolic landscapes that map emotional and psychological territories through metaphorical imagery. The reversed clock. When a clock showing 11:51 is reflected in a mirror, what time appears in the reflection? The answer requires visualizing mirror symmetry. The reflection shows 12:09. This illustrates how reflection transforms objects in predictable, yet sometimes surprising ways. Mirror symmetry appears throughout nature, from bilateral organisms to physical laws. Most fundamental physics equations remain unchanged when reflected, though weak nuclear force breaks this symmetry. Our brains possess remarkable specialization for processing reflections. Studies show specific neural pathways dedicated to recognizing mirrored relationships, explaining how we instantly understand reflections despite their complexity. Yet our intuition about mirrors often proves incorrect. Many people mistakenly believe mirrors reverse left and right, but not up and down. In reality, mirrors reverse along the axis perpendicular to their surface. The apparent left-right reversal happens because we mentally rotate our bodies when facing a mirror. Consciousness itself has been compared to a mirror, reflecting reality while subtly transforming it. Unlike physical mirrors, however, consciousness selectively reflects, highlighting some aspects while filtering others based on attention, expectation, and prior knowledge. Dreams represent another kind of reflection, mirroring our waking concerns through symbolic imagery that transforms experiences like a curious mirror. As you drift toward sleep, your consciousness will soon begin reflecting your day's experiences through the distorting mirror of dreams. The mysterious inheritance. A wealthy person leaves their fortune to 3 sons, 1/2 to the oldest, 1/3 to the middle, and 1/9 to the youngest. With 17 horses, how can these fractions be distributed without killing any horses? This mathematical puzzle reveals how changing perspective can solve seemingly impossible problems. The executor brings 1 additional horse temporarily, making 18. Now the oldest gets 9 horses, 1/2 of 18. The middle son gets 6, 1/3 of 18. And the youngest gets 2, 1/9 of 18. That's 17 total, leaving the borrowed horse to be returned. This elegant solution demonstrates how proper framing transforms intractable problems. Many scientific breakthroughs involve similar reframing. Einstein recognized that gravity could be reconceptualized as space-time curvature. Darwin saw species variation through the lens of natural selection. Consciousness research similarly requires perspective shifts. The hard problem of how physical processes create subjective experience might require fundamentally new frameworks. Some propose panpsychism. Consciousness is a fundamental property alongside mass and charge. Others suggest reality is fundamentally mental rather than physical. Still, others reconceptualize consciousness as information integration. As you prepare for sleep, consider how dreams provide another perspective shift, allowing your mind to approach problems from entirely different angles, sometimes yielding insights unavailable to waking consciousness. The endless staircase. If you drop a red hat down a 50-foot well, how many seconds will it take to hit the bottom? The apparent physics problem actually hinges on wordplay. A red hat doesn't turn into something else by falling, so the answer is trivially, a red hat, still. This riddle demonstrates how preconceptions shape our thinking. Expecting a physics problem, we miss the wordplay. Expectation, similarly, shapes perception. In the famous gorilla experiment, observers counting basketball passes missed a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene. This inattentional blindness reveals how attention filters reality based on expectations. Language itself structures cognition through frames and metaphors that highlight certain aspects of experience while hiding others. Quantum physics demonstrates similar expectation effects. The questions we ask determine which aspects of quantum systems become defined. The observer effect shows that measurement itself influences what's being measured. Consciousness research faces similar challenges. How we conceptualize and study awareness influences what we discover about it. The frameworks we use, whether neuroscientific, psychological, or philosophical, highlight certain aspects while potentially obscuring others. As you transition towards sleep, notice how your expectations about falling asleep might actually interfere with the process, illustrating how consciousness can sometimes obstruct its own transformation through excessive self-monitoring. The living statue. I speak without a mouth and hear without ears. I have no body, but I come alive with wind. What am I? An echo presents the traditional answer, though modern interpretations might include electronic assistants like Siri or Alexa. This riddle highlights how consciousness-like properties can emerge from systems lacking traditional biological structures. When we interact with an echo, it responds to us in ways that seem almost conversational. Similarly, artificial intelligence increasingly mimics aspects of consciousness without necessarily possessing it. This raises profound questions about what consciousness actually requires. Must it be biological? Can it emerge from silicon rather than carbon? Philosophers distinguish between consciousness, subjective experience, and intelligence, problem-solving ability. A system might demonstrate the latter without possessing the former, what philosophers call a philosophical zombie. The Chinese room thought experiment illustrates this distinction. A person who doesn't speak Chinese could theoretically manipulate Chinese symbols according to rules to produce appropriate responses without understanding Chinese. Similarly, AI might produce consciousness-like outputs without actual subjective experience. As sleep approaches, consider this distinction in yourself. Soon, your body will continue functioning while your conscious experience temporarily vanishes, demonstrating how biological processes can continue without awareness. The absolute truth. A man says, "If I'm telling the truth, I'll go to heaven. If I'm lying, I'll go to hell." If the man goes to hell, what does this mean? This logical puzzle creates a paradox. If he goes to hell, he must be lying. But if he's lying, then the opposite of his statement is true. Therefore, it's not the case that truth-telling leads to heaven and lying leads to hell. But this contradicts common religious frameworks. The riddle demonstrates how self-reference can create logical paradoxes that break conventional reasoning. Similar paradoxes appear throughout philosophy and mathematics. The liar paradox? This statement is false, creates an unresolvable contradiction. If the statement is true, it must be false. If it's false, it must be true. Gödel's incompleteness. Theorems prove that any consistent mathematical system must contain true statements that cannot be proven within that system. Self-reference creates these fundamental limitations in logical systems. Consciousness exhibits similar self-referential properties. When you think about your own thinking, observer and observed are the same entity, creating potential logical loops. Some philosophers argue this self-reference is key to consciousness, allowing systems to model themselves and create self-awareness. As you drift toward sleep, your consciousness gradually loses this self-referential quality, as awareness of being aware fades into simple awareness, and finally into the unconsciousness of deep sleep. The inverted pyramid. You have 8 identical balls with one slightly heavier. Using a balance scale, how can you identify the heavier ball in just 2 weighings? This classic puzzle requires optimal information gathering. The solution? Divide the balls into 3 groups, 3, 3, and 2. Weigh the first 2 groups of 3 against each other. If they balance, the heavy ball is in the remaining group of 2. Weigh those against each other to find it. If the first weighing shows imbalance, take the heavier side's 3 balls and weigh 2 against each other. If they balance, the third is heavy. If not, the heavier one is heavy. This demonstrates binary search algorithms, optimally dividing possibilities to maximize information gain with each step. Your brain employs similar strategies to efficiently process information. Predictive processing theories suggest perception works by continuously testing hypotheses against sensory data, updating predictions to minimize surprises. This efficient processing allows your brain to construct rich, conscious experiences from limited data. Scientific methodology follows similar principles, formulating hypotheses that maximally distinguish between competing theories, then testing them. Consciousness itself might have evolved as an information optimization strategy, allowing organisms to model their environment and themselves more effectively. As you prepare for sleep, your brain continues optimizing information, consolidating memories by preserving essential patterns while discarding irrelevant details. The frozen flame. What gets wetter as it dries? A towel presents this riddle's answer, a simple inverse relationship that challenges how we typically frame concepts. This linguistic reversal highlights the contextual nature of meaning. Words only make sense within specific frames of reference. Wetter here refers to the towel absorbing water, while dries refers to removing moisture from something else. Similar semantic frames shape all our thinking, often invisibly. We unconsciously apply frames like time is money, we spend or save time, or argument is war. We defend positions or attack weak points. These frames aren't merely linguistic, but structure how we conceptualize reality. Even scientific concepts depend on metaphorical frames. We describe electrons as particles or waves, though they're neither in the familiar sense. Consciousness similarly eludes direct description, requiring metaphorical frames like stream of consciousness or spotlight of attention. These metaphors shape how researchers conceptualize and study awareness. Some traditions suggest our ordinary frames fundamentally misconstrue consciousness, requiring radical perspective shifts to perceive its true nature. As sleep approaches, notice how your ordinary frames of reference gradually dissolve. The boundary between wakefulness and sleep isn't sharp, but involves transitional hypnagogic states where conventional thinking gives way to more fluid associations. The wordless book. What has pages but no words? Traditional answers include photo albums, sketchbooks, and blank journals, though modern interpretations might suggest e-readers when powered off. This riddle highlights how objects can maintain identity despite missing seemingly essential properties. Similarly, you remain yourself despite constant change. Your body replaces most cells regularly, your beliefs and memories evolve, and your consciousness disappears nightly during sleep, yet continuity of identity persists. Philosophical thought experiments probe this persistence. The ship of Theseus, gradually replacing every plank until no original material remains, questions whether it's still the same ship. Teleportation scenarios ask whether disassembling and perfectly reconstructing you elsewhere creates the same person or a duplicate. Consciousness presents similar puzzles. During dreamless sleep, awareness temporarily vanishes. When it reappears upon waking, is it the same consciousness or merely a functional equivalent? The continuity of identity despite change remains one of philosophy's oldest questions. Some traditions, like Buddhism, suggest our sense of persistent selfhood is ultimately illusory, a useful fiction rather than fundamental reality. As you drift toward sleep, your consciousness will soon temporarily vanish, yet you'll awaken feeling like the same person, illustrating this mysterious continuity despite interruption. The broken watch. A watch stopped at 3:15. What time is it? The riddle's answer is simply, time to fix the watch, though this seemingly trivial response raises deeper questions about how we measure time. A broken watch, frozen at a single moment, contrasts with time's constant flow. Yet physics suggests our intuitive understanding of time may be fundamentally incorrect. Einstein's relativity demonstrates that time passes differently depending on gravity and relative motion. At the quantum level, time becomes even stranger, with some interpretations suggesting particles can influence each other instantaneously across any distance, challenging our notion of temporal sequence. Neuroscience reveals that our subjective experience of time differs from objective measurement. Time seems to slow during danger, speed up during enjoyment, and vanish entirely during flow states of deep engagement. Even more mysteriously, our sense of now, the present moment that feels so special, has no clear physical correlate. Physics equations don't privilege any particular moment as now. This suggests that our experience of flowing time might be a construction of consciousness rather than a fundamental aspect of reality. As you prepare for sleep, your perception of time will soon transform dramatically, with hours passing subjectively in what might feel like moments. The impossible meeting. Two mothers and two daughters went shopping, spending $75 total, with each spending the same amount. How is this possible? The answer hinges on recognizing that three people, a grandmother, her daughter, and her granddaughter, satisfy the description. Each is simultaneously a mother and a daughter, except the granddaughter, who is only a daughter, allowing each to spend $25. This riddle demonstrates how shifting perspective reveals hidden solutions. Many scientific breakthroughs similarly involve recognizing that multiple descriptions can apply to the same entity. Light behaves as both wave and particle. Matter and energy are different expressions of the same underlying reality. Consciousness itself presents similar dual aspects. From outside, we observe neural activity, patterns of electrochemical signaling. From inside, we experience thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. These seemingly different phenomena might represent dual aspects of a single reality. Some philosophers suggest consciousness might be what the physical world looks like from the inside. Just as temperature represents the average kinetic energy of molecules from a macroscopic perspective, perhaps consciousness represents what information integration looks like from an internal perspective. As sleep approaches, consider how dreams will soon offer yet another perspective on reality. Neither objective nor subjective in the usual sense, but a hybrid state with its own unique characteristics. The sealed letter. What begins with E ends with E, but contains only one letter. The answer is envelope, a container with just one letter inside. This wordplay demonstrates how language creates multiple meanings that interact in unexpected ways. Letter can mean both a written message and a character in the alphabet. Such semantic ambiguity appears throughout language, creating both confusion and creative possibility. Our brains navigate these ambiguities remarkably well, instantly selecting the appropriate meaning based on context. However, this process sometimes fails, creating garden path sentences that force us to backtrack and reinterpret. Consciousness itself operates through similar layers of meaning. Your subjective experience contains both primary content, what you're aware of, and meta-awareness, knowing that you're aware. These levels intertwine yet remain distinct, creating the rich texture of conscious experience. Some philosophers argue consciousness essentially involves this self-referential quality, awareness that includes awareness of itself. This creates interesting paradoxes. If consciousness is awareness of awareness, what is the original awareness aware of? This potential infinite regression parallels similar paradoxes in mathematics and logic. As you drift toward sleep, your meta-awareness gradually diminishes. You'll remain briefly aware of sensations and thoughts, but your awareness of being aware will fade first as consciousness disassembles itself layer by layer. The moving mountain. What moves faster, heat or cold? The playful answer. Cold, because you can catch a cold, illustrates how language creates connections between unrelated concepts through shared words. Beyond wordplay, this riddle invites us to consider how we perceive temperature. We don't actually feel cold directly. We sense heat leaving our bodies. Cold isn't a thing, but an absence, much like darkness is the absence of light. This reflects a broader pattern where human perception often constructs seemingly positive experiences from negative conditions. Similarly, silence isn't perceived as a neutral baseline, but as a positive presence in contrast to noise. Consciousness researchers note similar patterns in awareness. We often notice changes more than static states, suggesting consciousness evolved primarily to detect differences rather than absolutes. Your nervous system adapts to constant stimuli through habituation, effectively making unchanging conditions invisible to awareness. Like feeling cold as heat leaving rather than something entering, many perceptual experiences represent constructed interpretations rather than direct receptions. Some philosophical traditions extend this insight, suggesting that consciousness itself might not be a positive phenomenon, but the absence of certain limitations or boundaries. As you prepare for sleep, notice how awareness gradually subtracts elements rather than simply shutting off. External awareness fades first, then self-awareness, leaving dream consciousness to emerge from what remains. The paradoxical prison. A prisoner is told, if you make a true statement, you'll be hanged. If you make a false statement, you'll be shot. What statement allows escape? The prisoner should say, I will be shot. This creates an unresolvable paradox. If the statement is true, the prisoner should be hanged, making the statement false. If it's false, the prisoner should be shot, making the statement true. Faced with this contradiction, execution becomes impossible. Similar self-referential paradoxes appear throughout logic and mathematics. The sentence, this statement is false, creates the same logical impossibility. If true, it's false. If false, it's true. Gödel's incompleteness. Theorems demonstrated that such paradoxes aren't mere curiosities, but reveal fundamental limitations in formal systems. Any consistent mathematical system complex enough to describe arithmetic must contain statements that cannot be proven or disproven within that system. Consciousness might have similar self-referential properties. When you think about your own thinking, observer and observed are the same entity, potentially creating logical loops. Some philosophers and scientists suggest this self-reference might be essential to consciousness, allowing systems to model themselves and creating self-awareness. As sleep approaches, your consciousness becomes less self-referential, gradually losing the ability to observe itself. This diminishing recursive awareness characterizes the transition from alert wakefulness to the simpler awareness of sleep onset. The unbroken circle. What has a neck but no head? Several answers exist. A bottle, a shirt, or a guitar all fit this description. These objects contain features named after body parts through metaphorical extension. We constantly apply bodily metaphors to inanimate objects. Chairs have arms. Tables have legs. Mountains have feet. This anthropomorphic tendency reveals how embodied experience shapes cognition. Our understanding of abstract concepts fundamentally depends on physical experience. We comprehend time through spatial metaphors, looking forward to events, leaving troubles behind. Emotional states through temperature, receiving a warm welcome, giving someone the cold shoulder. And importance through size, making a big decision, addressing small concerns. Cognitive linguists like Lakoff and Johnson argue these aren't merely linguistic conventions, but reveal how embodiment structures thought itself. Consciousness research increasingly recognizes this embodied nature of mind. Rather than seeing consciousness as abstract information, processing happening incidentally in a body, embodied cognition suggests awareness fundamentally depends on physical embodiment. Some philosophers argue that consciousness extends beyond the brain to include bodily processes and even interactions with the environment. As you drift toward sleep, notice how bodily sensations, heaviness in limbs, slowing breath, relaxing muscles, don't merely accompany consciousness changes, but constitute them. The transition to sleep happens not just in your brain, but throughout your embodied existence. The cosmic egg. I am the beginning of everything, the end of everywhere. I'm the beginning of eternity, the end of time and space. What am I? The answer is the letter E. The first letter in everything and eternity. The last letter in everywhere, time and space. This riddle demonstrates how abstractions can be created from superficial patterns. The letter E has no cosmic significance, yet the riddle creates an impression of profundity by highlighting selective patterns. Our minds excel at pattern recognition, so much that we often find meaningful patterns in random data, a phenomenon called apophenia. This tendency appears in superstitions, conspiracy theories, and pareidolia, seeing faces in random patterns. While sometimes misleading, this pattern-seeking ability drives scientific discovery and artistic creativity. Consciousness itself might represent a pattern recognition system that evolved to identify meaningful relationships in sensory data. However, this pattern seeking can create illusions of understanding. We construct narratives that seem to explain phenomena by highlighting selected connections while ignoring contradictory information. Even scientific theories are vulnerable to this confirmation bias, requiring rigorous testing to overcome our tendency to see only evidence that supports existing beliefs. As sleep approaches, your brain continues seeking patterns, organizing the day's experiences into meaningful narratives. This pattern making persists even in dreams, creating stories from random neural activation, perhaps explaining why dreams often contain seemingly profound connections that dissolve upon waking. The inaudible sound. What word is pronounced the same even after removing 4 of its 5 letters? The answer is Q. Remove all but Q, and the pronunciation remains unchanged. This linguistic curiosity demonstrates how arbitrary the relationship between spelling and sound can be. Languages evolve organically rather than logically, accumulating historical artifacts and inconsistencies. Similarly, consciousness didn't emerge as a perfectly designed system, but evolved through incremental adaptations, serving survival and reproduction. This evolutionary history explains many quirks of awareness. We're hyper-attentive to potential threats, but easily miss gradual changes. We have specialized brain regions for face recognition, but struggle with abstract statistics. Our emotions influence cognitive processing in ways that sometimes help and sometimes hinder accurate assessment. Just as Q carries unnecessary letters, consciousness contains features that reflect its evolutionary history rather than optimal design. Dream consciousness particularly reveals these evolutionary layers. The intense emotions, bizarre narratives, and vivid imagery of dreams may represent the brain's oldest consciousness systems, operating without the logical constraints of newer cognitive mechanisms. Some theorists suggest consciousness evolved primarily for social coordination, rather than accurate representation of reality, explaining why awareness functions differently in social contexts than in isolation. As you transition toward sleep, your consciousness gradually shifts from newer, more logical systems toward older, more emotionally driven mechanisms that will ultimately generate your dream experiences. The impenetrable cloud. I have keys but no locks. I have space but no room. You can enter but you can't go outside. What am I? The answer is a keyboard. Its keys don't open locks. Its spacebar creates space without physical dimensions, and you can input information but not physically enter it. This riddle works by repurposing familiar features in unexpected contexts, demonstrating how language creates meaning through relationships rather than intrinsic properties. Similarly, neuroscience suggests consciousness emerges from relationships between neurons rather than from any special properties of individual brain cells. No single neuron is conscious. Awareness emerges from patterns of interaction across billions of cells. Complex systems throughout nature demonstrate this emergent quality. Ant colonies exhibit intelligence no individual ant possesses. Market economies coordinate resources without central control. Weather patterns form coherent structures from countless molecular interactions. Consciousness might represent the most remarkable emergence in nature, subjective experience arising from physical processes that individually show no signs of awareness. Some philosophers argue consciousness requires a special explanatory approach, precisely because of this dramatic emergence. While we can trace physical processes leading to awareness, explaining why these processes create subjective experience remains challenging. As sleep approaches, your consciousness will soon transform into entirely different patterns of emergence. The distinct phenomenology of dreams arising from new relationships between neural systems as waking consciousness disassembles. The missing penny. 3 people check into a hotel room for $30, paying $10 each. Later, the manager realizes the room should only cost $25 and sends $5 back. The bellhop gives each person $1 and keeps $2. Now each person paid $9, totaling $27, and the bellhop has $2, which equals $29. Where's the missing dollar? This riddle creates confusion by mixing different accounting methods. The correct calculation: the guest paid $27, $30, $3 returned, with $25 going to the hotel and $2 to the bellhop. Everything balances. The apparent paradox comes from incorrectly adding the $27 paid and the $2 kept by the bellhop, which inappropriately mixes payments and receipts. This illustrates how framing affects problem solving. The proper accounting framework immediately resolves the apparent contradiction. Similar framing effects appear throughout cognition. How we conceptualize problems dramatically influences our ability to solve them. In the famous candle problem, participants must attach a candle to a wall using only a box of tacks. The solution, tacking the box itself to the wall as a platform, becomes much easier when the box is presented empty rather than filled with tacks, illustrating how mental frameworks can create artificial constraints. Consciousness research similarly depends on framing. The hard problem of how physical processes generate subjective experience might result partly from how we frame the relationship between brain and mind. Alternative frameworks, perhaps seeing matter as inherently experiential or consciousness as a fundamental property alongside mass and charge, could transform seemingly intractable problems into more manageable questions. The immortal phoenix. I can fly without wings. I can cry without eyes. Wherever I go, darkness follows me. What am I? The answer is a cloud. It flies without wings, cries, rain without eyes, and casts shadows, darkness below. This poetic personification demonstrates how metaphor shapes understanding. We comprehend abstract or unfamiliar phenomena by mapping features from familiar domains. Clouds don't literally fly or cry, yet these metaphors help us conceptualize their movement and precipitation. Cognitive science reveals metaphor isn't merely linguistic ornamentation, but a fundamental mechanism of thought. Abstract concepts like time flies, importance, big issues, and emotional states, feeling down, are understood through metaphorical mappings from physical experiences. Consciousness itself eludes direct description, forcing us to employ metaphors like stream of consciousness, spotlight of attention, or theater of mind. These aren't just convenient expressions, but shape how we conceptualize our own awareness. Different metaphors highlight different aspects of consciousness while obscuring others. The spotlight metaphor emphasizes selectivity, but downplays how attention shapes what it illuminates. The stream metaphor captures continuity, but misses how consciousness actively constructs experience rather than passively receiving it. As sleep approaches, notice how your drowsy consciousness takes on dreamlike qualities that resist straightforward metaphors. Neither spotlight nor stream quite captures the peculiar awareness of the hypnagogic state between wakefulness and sleep. The invisible thread. I am always hungry and will die if not fed, but whatever I touch will soon turn red. What am I? Fire presents the traditional answer. It consumes fuel, extinguishes without it, and turns materials red hot. This personification illustrates our tendency to understand natural phenomena through animate qualities. We speak of fire, eating, waves crashing, and winds howling, applying intentional language to non-intentional processes. This anthropomorphic thinking appears across cultures and throughout history. Ancient peoples saw conscious agents behind natural events, storm gods hurling lightning, harvest goddesses providing food. While science has replaced these literal interpretations, the cognitive tendency persists. We still speak of nature, finding solutions, or genes, wanting to replicate, subtly implying purpose where only mechanism exists. Consciousness research must carefully navigate this tendency. When studying awareness objectively, we risk inappropriately projecting conscious qualities onto neural mechanisms. Conversely, in explaining consciousness through physical processes, we risk eliminating the very phenomenon we're trying to explain. Some philosophers argue our conceptual framework itself may be inadequate. Perhaps consciousness neither reduces to physical processes nor stands apart from them, but requires a fundamentally different conceptualization altogether. As you drift toward sleep, notice how consciousness gradually transforms. The purposeful, directed thinking of wakefulness gives way to the meandering associations of drowsiness, illustrating consciousness's variable nature, even within your own experience. The quantum dice. If you throw a red stone into a blue sea, what will it become? The answer, wet, demonstrates how expectations shape thinking. We anticipate a color change, but get a physical state change instead. This misdirection parallels quantum measurement, where the questions we ask determine which properties become defined. Observing a quantum particle's position prevents precisely knowing its momentum. The answer depends on what we choose to measure. Similarly, consciousness changes based on how we observe it. Introspection alters the mental states being examined. Detecting awareness in others depends heavily on how we define and measure it. Brain scans reveal activity correlating with consciousness, but these correlations depend on how researchers operationalize the concept. What counts as consciousness shapes what we find. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally resists objective measurement, precisely because subjective experience cannot be fully captured through third-person observation. The observer effect in physics finds parallels in consciousness studies. The act of observation changes what's observed. Studies show that directing attention toward breathing actually alters breathing patterns. Asking participants to report emotional states influences those very states. As sleep approaches, notice how attempting to observe your own drowsiness can temporarily increase alertness, demonstrating this observer effect in your own experience. The very act of monitoring your consciousness as you fall asleep can paradoxically prevent the transition you're attempting to observe. The recurring dream. What comes once in a minute, twice in a moment, but never in 1,000 years? The answer is the letter M, appearing once in minute, twice in moment, and not at all in 1,000 years. This lexical puzzle highlights patterns invisible until specifically sought. Similarly, consciousness contains patterns we rarely notice until deliberately attending to them. For instance, your visual field doesn't end sharply, but fades into indistinctness at the periphery. You're constantly unaware of your blind spot, where the optic nerve connects to the retina. Your eyes make constant small movements, called saccades, yet your perception seems stable. These features remain invisible until specifically examined through directed attention. Meditation traditions systematically explore such overlooked aspects of consciousness. Practitioners report discovering unexpected patterns in their experience, how thoughts arise and fade, how sensations transform under sustained attention, how the apparent solidity of selfhood dissolves under examination. Neuroscience reveals similar hidden patterns. What seems like continuous perception actually occurs in discrete chunks, with the brain constructing the illusion of continuity. What appears as direct perception actually involves substantial construction based on expectation and prior knowledge. As you drift toward sleep, new patterns emerge in consciousness. Hypnagogic imagery, loosening associations, diminishing meta-awareness. These transitions reveal the flexible, dynamic nature of awareness that remains hidden during normal waking consciousness. The untraceable path. The more you take, the more you leave behind. What are they? The answer? Footprints. Highlights how actions create their own evidence. Each step forward leaves a mark of where you've been. This physical metaphor extends to consciousness, which similarly leaves traces of its activity. Memory represents consciousness creating footprints in neural pathways. Each experience potentially creates lasting changes in synaptic connections, allowing past conscious states to influence future ones. These memory traces vary in permanence. Some last minutes, others a lifetime. Modern neuroscience tracks these footprints through techniques like functional MRI, which measures blood flow indicating neural activity. Though we can observe these physical correlates, the subjective experience itself remains private, and direct access to another's consciousness remains impossible. Some philosophers suggest this privacy represents consciousness's fundamental nature. The subjective cannot be fully translated into objective terms. Certain forms of consciousness leave fainter footprints. Dreams often evaporate upon waking despite their vivid presence during sleep. Hypnagogic experiences, the hallucinatory imagery occurring as you fall asleep, frequently vanish from memory. Some spiritual traditions seek states of pure consciousness that allegedly leave no conceptual traces. Awareness without content that cannot be remembered in ordinary terms. As you approach sleep, notice how your pre-sleep thoughts often disappear from memory, like footprints washing away in rising tide. The aging portrait. I am an odd number. Take away a letter and I become even. What number am I? The answer is 7. Remove the letter S and it becomes even. This wordplay reveals how meaning emerges from interpretation context. The riddle works because odd and even operate simultaneously as mathematical properties and as the word even itself. Similarly, consciousness functions through multiple interpretive frameworks simultaneously. Your visual system processes color, shape, motion, and depth in parallel streams that consciousness integrates into unified perception. Your brain simultaneously evaluates experiences emotionally, conceptually, and physically, creating the rich texture of conscious experience. Some neurological conditions disrupt this integration. Synesthesia creates unusual crossovers, like seeing colors when hearing music. Certain brain injuries can cause agnosia, inability to recognize objects despite intact sensory processing. These conditions reveal consciousness's constructed nature. Rather than passively receiving reality, your awareness actively integrates and interprets information through multiple frameworks. Dreams represent another state where interpretive frameworks shift dramatically. Dream consciousness often accepts logical impossibilities and identity transformations that waking consciousness would immediately reject. As you transition towards sleep, notice how interpretive flexibility increases. Thoughts become more associative, imagery more fluid, and logical constraints loosen, revealing consciousness's malleable interpretive nature even before dreams fully emerge. The eternal thirst. What can run but never walks, has a mouth but never talks, has a head but never weeps, has a bed but never sleeps? A river embodies this poetic riddle's answer. This metaphorical description demonstrates how we understand natural phenomena through bodily mappings. Rivers don't literally have mouths or heads, yet these metaphors help us conceptualize their features. This anthropomorphic framing extends beyond language into perception itself. Studies in cognitive psychology reveal that people more readily attribute intentionality to objects that appear to move purposefully, especially those with front-back orientations, suggesting facing in a particular direction. This tendency to animate the inanimate likely evolved as an adaptive strategy. Better to mistake a bush for a predator than a predator for a bush. Consciousness itself gets understood through similar metaphorical mappings. We describe awareness as a stream flowing through time, attention as a spotlight illuminating certain contents, or mind as a container holding thoughts. These aren't merely convenient expressions, but shape how we conceptualize our own experience. Some philosophical traditions suggest these metaphors fundamentally misconstrue consciousness, requiring direct experiential investigation rather than conceptual understanding. Certain meditation practices aim to experience consciousness without the distortions of metaphorical framing. As sleep approaches, notice how drowsy consciousness begins to generate its own metaphorical translations. Abstract thoughts transform into concrete imagery. Emotions manifest as scenes or characters, creating the symbolic landscape of dreams. The mirrored room. Two people are in a room. They're born on the same day, same month, same year, from the same mother and father, yet they're not twins. How is this possible? They're triplets, or part of any larger multiple birth. The riddle misdirects by suggesting only two possibilities. This demonstrates binary thinking's limitations. When we automatically frame situations as either or, we miss additional possibilities. This binary limitation appears throughout cognition. We categorize stimuli as either this or that, missing intermediate gradations. We frame decisions as between two options when multiple paths exist. We think in dichotomies: mind-body, subjective, objective, conscious, unconscious. Consciousness research particularly suffers from false dichotomies. We ask whether consciousness is physical or non-physical, whether it evolved for survival or emerged as a byproduct, whether it's uniquely human or shared with other species. These framings obscure possibilities beyond binary opposition. Perhaps consciousness has both physical and non-physical aspects. Maybe it evolved partially for survival advantages while certain features emerged as byproducts. Possibly consciousness exists on a spectrum across species rather than being present or absent. Eastern philosophical traditions often emphasize transcending such dualities. Concepts like Advaita, non-dualism, in Hindu philosophy or the middle way in Buddhism, suggest reality transcends binary oppositions. As sleep approaches, your consciousness begins transcending waking dichotomies. The clear boundary between perception and imagination blurs. The distinction between self and world softens. These transitions reveal how binary frameworks apply primarily to ordinary waking consciousness rather than consciousness in all its manifestations. The broken calendar. How many seconds are in a year? The traditional answer, 12, humorously reinterprets seconds as the second of each month, rather than time units. This linguistic ambiguity demonstrates how interpretation frames determine meaning. Words don't possess inherent meanings, but acquire significance through context. Similarly, consciousness doesn't record raw reality, but interprets sensory data through contextual frames. Your visual system doesn't passively register light patterns, but actively constructs perceptual objects based on expectations and prior knowledge. What you see represents your brain's best guess about what sensory data means within current contexts. This interpretive nature explains many perceptual phenomena. The same physical stimulus appears differently depending on surrounding context. A gray square looks lighter against a dark background than against a light one. The same sound patterns become different words depending on linguistic context. The identical social behavior gets interpreted differently based on cultural expectations. Some philosophical traditions suggest this interpretive quality extends to consciousness itself. Rather than directly experiencing reality, we experience our interpretation of reality, a model constructed by the brain based on sensory input, prior experience, and evolutionary programming. As sleep approaches, your interpretive frameworks gradually shift. The strict logical constraints of waking consciousness loosen, allowing imagery and thoughts to transform through associative rather than literal connections, creating the fluid interpretative landscape of dreams. The voiceless singer. What has many keys but can't open a single lock? A piano provides this riddle's traditional answer, though a computer keyboard works equally well. This metaphorical extension, calling both piano buttons and lock opening tools keys, despite their different functions, demonstrates how language creates categories through perceived similarities. Our minds constantly categorize experience, grouping diverse phenomena into conceptual sets based on shared features. This categorization shapes perception itself. Studies show that language influences how we perceive colors. Speakers of languages with different color categories actually see color boundaries differently. Similar effects appear with spatial relationships, time perception, and even emotional experiences. Without realizing it, our conscious experience gets structured by these implicit categorization systems. Consciousness researchers face similar categorization challenges. What exactly counts as consciousness? Should we include dream states, minimal awareness during deep sleep, or altered states from meditation or psychedelics? Are insects conscious? What about artificial intelligence systems? How we categorize these phenomena fundamentally shapes our theories and investigations. Some philosophical traditions suggest our very concept of consciousness might miscategorize experience, artificially separating awareness from its contents. Non-dual traditions propose that the subject-object distinction represents a conceptual imposition rather than a fundamental feature of awareness. As sleep approaches, notice how fixed categories begin dissolving. The boundary between thinking and perceiving blurs. The distinction between self and world softens. These transitions reveal how categorical frameworks may be features of particular consciousness, states rather than consciousness itself. The hidden door. I am taken from a mine and shut in a wooden case from which I am never released, yet almost everyone uses me. What am I? Pencil lead, graphite, provides the answer. Extracted from mines, encased in wood, gradually used until too small to be released. This riddle describes transformational containment, something becoming useful precisely through its confinement. Similar transformative containment appears in consciousness. Your attention's limited capacity, rather than being merely a restriction, allows for focused processing that transforms raw sensation into meaningful perception. Studies show that attention enhances neural responses to selected stimuli while suppressing responses to unattended inputs. Without this selective containment, consciousness would be overwhelmed by sensory chaos. Language similarly contains thought within structural boundaries that enable more sophisticated cognition. By constraining expression to grammatical patterns, language allows for complex idea communication impossible in its absence. Even memory benefits from constraint. Forgetting, rather than being merely a system limitation, allows for more efficient retrieval of relevant information by reducing interference. Some spiritual traditions extend this principle, suggesting that consciousness realizes its potential not through unlimited expansion, but through disciplined containment in meditation or contemplative practice. As sleep approaches, your consciousness undergoes its own transformation through containment. Awareness narrows, external stimuli fade, and attention turns inward. This natural narrowing doesn't merely reduce consciousness, but transforms it into the distinctive awareness of the hypnagogic state, and eventually dreams. The eternal triangle. How can you arrange 6 matchsticks to form exactly 4 triangles of equal size? The solution requires thinking beyond 2 dimensions. Creating a triangular pyramid, tetrahedron with 4 triangular faces. This dimensional shift demonstrates how seemingly impossible problems become solvable by transcending implicit constraints. We frequently impose unnecessary limitations based on assumptions rather than stated requirements. Similar dimensional thinking applies to consciousness. We typically conceptualize awareness as 3-dimensional, reflecting our physical perception. Yet consciousness contains additional dimensions beyond spatial ones: intensity, emotional valence, clarity, and temporal extent, among others. Some experiences feel deeper than others without occupying more physical space. Certain states of consciousness reveal qualitative dimensions normally inaccessible. Mystical experiences often involve reported awareness of higher dimensions or transcendence of ordinary spatial constraints. Mathematics suggests physical reality might contain more dimensions than the 3 we perceive, with string theory proposing 10 or 11 dimensions, with additional ones compactified beyond direct perception. Some theorists suggest consciousness might relate to these additional dimensions, perhaps explaining subjective experiences' seemingly non-physical qualities. Dreams particularly demonstrate consciousness's dimensional flexibility. Dream experiences often violate normal spatial constraints, spaces that morph, perspectives that shouldn't be physically possible, transitions between scenes without traversing intervening space. As sleep approaches, your spatial perception will gradually transform, sometimes creating distinctive hypnagogic experiences of falling or floating that reveal consciousness's dimensional malleability. The lightless room. A man enters a completely dark room with 10 people wearing either black or white hats. He must separate them into 2 groups, so all people with the same hat color are in the same group. How can he do this without seeing the colors? The elegant solution: separate them into any 2 groups, then ask one person from each group to count how many white hats they see in the other group. If the counts match, the separation is incorrect. If they differ, it's correct. This demonstrates how meta-information can substitute for direct information. Without seeing colors directly, the man can still organize by color through strategic information gathering. Consciousness employs similar strategies. You never directly perceive the external world. Your brain receives electrochemical signals from sensory organs and constructs a working model based on this indirect information. This Bayesian brain approach suggests perception works by testing hypotheses against sensory data, gradually refining internal models to minimize prediction errors. Similarly, we infer others' conscious states without direct access to their experiences. By observing behavior, facial expressions, and verbal reports, we make sophisticated inferences about minds we cannot directly perceive. Some philosophers suggest this same process applies reflexively. Rather than directly experiencing our own consciousness, we might construct self-models based on internal signals, creating the compelling illusion of direct self-access. As sleep approaches, notice how your inferences about your own consciousness become less reliable. You might think you're still awake moments after actually falling asleep, demonstrating the constructed nature of even self-awareness. The drowning ship. A boat has a ladder with 6 rungs, each 1 foot apart. The bottom rung is 1 foot from the water. The tide rises at 1 foot per hour. After 5 hours, how many rungs are underwater? The answer is 1, not 5, as intuition suggests. The boat floats with the tide, maintaining the ladder's position relative to the water surface. This challenging our default assumptions about fixed versus relative reference frames. We naturally assume the ladder remains stationary while water rises, missing that boats move with water levels. Similar reference frame errors affect consciousness. We perceive objects as having fixed properties like color, size, and shape, overlooking how these qualities depend on perspective, context, and perceptual conditions. Color constancy illustrates this. We perceive objects as maintaining consistent colors despite dramatic lighting changes that alter the wavelengths reaching our eyes. Size constancy similarly maintains perceived object size despite distance changes. These perceptual mechanisms create an illusion of mind-independent reality, when perception actually involves sophisticated construction from limited data. Some philosophical traditions suggest similar reference frame errors affect our understanding of consciousness itself. We perceive consciousness as a fixed observing entity separate from its contents, missing how awareness and its objects might represent different aspects of a unified process. Various contemplative practices attempt to shift this reference frame, experiencing consciousness not as a separate observer, but as the knowing quality inherent in experience itself. As sleep approaches, your ordinary reference frames gradually dissolve, revealing consciousness's more fluid nature through hypnagogic experiences that blend perception, imagination, and thought in ways that transcend waking distinctions. The unheard echo. What is so fragile that saying its name breaks it? Silence provides this riddle's elegant answer. The mere act of naming silence destroys the very thing named. This self-referential paradox parallels similar phenomena in consciousness. Certain mental states transform or dissolve when explicitly noted. When you suddenly become aware you're daydreaming, the daydream typically ends. Flow states, periods of complete absorption in an activity, often terminate when you notice you're experiencing them. Even emotions can transform through observation. Intense anger sometimes diminishes when you become explicitly aware of feeling angry. Meditation traditions systematically explore this observer effect on consciousness. Practitioners report that sustained attention on thoughts, emotions, or sensations transforms these experiences, often diminishing their intensity or revealing their constructed nature. Some traditions explicitly seek states of pure awareness or non-dual consciousness that allegedly cannot be observed as objects because observation itself is their fundamental nature. Scientific attention affects consciousness similarly. The moment we study subjective experience scientifically, we potentially alter what we're studying. Asking subjects to report on their experiences may change those very experiences. The act of observation becomes part of what's observed, creating unavoidable methodological challenges. As sleep approaches, notice how attempting to observe the transition moment between wakefulness and sleep often prevents that very transition, demonstrating how consciousness shifts through processes that resist direct observation. The endless chain. Forward. I am heavy, but backward I am not. What am I? The answer is ton, read backward as not. This palindromic riddle demonstrates how perspective determines meaning. The same letters arranged differently create opposite meanings. This perspectival nature applies to consciousness itself. The identical brain activity might generate entirely different subjective experiences depending on context and attention. Consider ambiguous images like the duck-rabbit illustration. The same visual input produces different perceptions depending on cognitive framing. Similarly, identical sensory stimuli can feel pleasant or unpleasant depending on expectations and context. Pain offers a striking example. The same physical sensation can be experienced as excruciating torture or intense pleasure depending on context, attention, and interpretation. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally involves such interpretive frameworks. Rather than passively recording reality, consciousness actively constructs experience through selected perspectives. Different states of consciousness might represent different interpretive frameworks rather than different contents. Contemplative practices aim to shift these frameworks, experiencing reality through alternate perspectives. Dreams represent natural perspective shifts, allowing experiences impossible in waking life. Flying dreams, for instance, experience gravity from an impossible perspective. As sleep approaches, your perspective gradually transforms. The first-person waking perspective, with its clear subject-object distinction, begins dissolving into the more fluid, less dualistic perspective of dream consciousness, revealing how fundamentally perspective shapes conscious experience. The undying flame. What kind of room has no doors or windows? The traditional answer, mushroom, plays with linguistic components rather than architectural features. This demonstrates how deconstructing and reconstructing concepts creates new meanings. Similar conceptual reconstruction occurs throughout conscious experience. Your perception constantly breaks sensory input into components, then reconstructs them into meaningful wholes. Vision decomposes scenes into features like edges, colors, and movements processed in separate brain regions before integration into coherent objects. Language processing similarly breaks speech streams into phonemes, words, and grammatical structures before reconstructing meaningful utterances. This constructive nature explains many perceptual phenomena. Visual illusions occur when reconstruction processes make incorrect inferences from limited data. False memories form when the brain reconstructs events based on suggestions or related information rather than actual experience. Dreams particularly demonstrate consciousness's constructive nature. The sleeping brain creates entire worlds from internal activation without external input. Some philosophical traditions suggest this constructive process extends beyond perception to the sense of self. Rather than representing a fundamental entity, the experience of being a unified self might emerge from various processes reconstructed into an apparently seamless whole. As sleep approaches, notice how this reconstructive process becomes more fluid and less constrained. Thoughts transform into images. Memories blend with current experiences, and logical constraints loosen, revealing consciousness's fundamentally constructive nature, even before dreams fully emerge. The shapeless shadow. I have cities, but no houses. I have mountains, but no trees. I have water, but no fish. What am I? A map provides this riddle's answer, representing features symbolically rather than containing them literally. This symbolic representation parallels how consciousness operates. Your mind never directly contains external reality, but creates symbolic representations that stand in for the actual world. These representations serve practical purposes rather than providing perfect copies. A map simplifies reality to highlight relevant features while omitting details, just as consciousness selectively represents aspects of reality useful for survival and reproduction. Like maps, which use arbitrary symbols, lines, colors, icons, to represent physical features, consciousness employs neural patterns that bear no obvious resemblance to what they represent. The neural activity representing apple shares no physical similarity with actual apples. This symbolic relationship creates the explanatory gap between brain processes and subjective experience that philosophers find so puzzling. Dreams particularly demonstrate consciousness's symbolic nature. Dream content often represents emotional concerns through metaphorical scenarios rather than literal replays of waking experiences. A dream about being chased might symbolize anxiety rather than recalling an actual pursuit. As sleep approaches, notice how your drowsy thoughts increasingly employ symbolic rather than literal representations. Abstract concerns transform into concrete imagery. Emotions manifest as scenes or characters, creating the symbolic landscape that characterizes dream consciousness. The Phantom Library. What comes at the end of everything? The answer is the letter G, the final letter in the word everything. This riddle uses linguistic surface features rather than deeper meaning. Similarly, consciousness often operates on surface patterns rather than deeper structures. Consider how easily optical illusions fool perception by exploiting surface-level processing. The Miller-Lyer illusion makes identical lines appear different lengths through simple arrow attachments. The checker shadow illusion makes identical gray squares appear different shades based on context. Your visual system processes these surface patterns automatically, creating perceptions that persist, even when you know they're incorrect. Language processing shows similar surface-level effects. Garden path sentences like, "The horse raced past the barn fell," confuse because we follow surface syntactic patterns rather than deeper meaning. Consciousness evolved to make quick, useful interpretations rather than perfect analyses. This tendency creates both efficiency and vulnerability to manipulation. Advertising exploits these surface-level processes, using imagery and language that trigger automatic associations rather than logical evaluation. Some philosophical traditions suggest ordinary consciousness remains trapped in surface-level processing, missing deeper realities that contemplative practices might reveal. As sleep approaches, notice how surface-level associations increasingly drive your thoughts. A word's sound might trigger an image. A shape might transform based on superficial similarity, revealing how consciousness naturally flows along surface patterns when logical constraints relax. The transparent wall. You have two identical ropes that burn inconsistently. Each takes exactly 1 hour to burn completely. How can you measure precisely 45 minutes? This temporal puzzle requires lateral thinking. The solution: light one rope at both ends. and the second rope at one end simultaneously. The first rope will burn completely in 30 minutes. Burning from both ends halves the time. When it finishes, light the other end of the second rope. Since the second rope has already burned for 30 minutes, it has 30 minutes remaining. Lighting the remaining portion from both ends will consume it in 15 minutes. Total time: 30 plus 15 equals 45 minutes. This demonstrates how transforming resources creates possibilities beyond their obvious use. Consciousness similarly transforms through restructuring. Default perception organizes sensory data according to pragmatic patterns: objects, categories, causes, and effects. But consciousness can reorganize this data differently. Artists restructure visual perception to notice relationships between shapes, colors, and spaces normally overlooked. Meditation practices train attention to organize experience around present moment sensations rather than conceptual categories. Psychedelics dramatically reorganize consciousness by disrupting default networks, creating novel perceptual organizations. Even ordinary problem solving involves restructuring mental representations until solutions emerge. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally involves such organization rather than raw sensation. What we experience depends not just on sensory input, but on how consciousness structures that input. As sleep approaches, your organization of experience naturally transforms. The tight, categorical distinctions of waking give way to fluid associations, revealing consciousness's inherent flexibility in structuring experience. The empty box. What is always in front of you but can't be seen? The future lies perpetually ahead yet remains invisible. This riddle highlights an essential aspect of consciousness: its temporal orientation. Your awareness doesn't just represent the present moment, but constantly projects forward, anticipating what comes next. This predictive nature appears throughout perception. Your visual system doesn't passively receive images, but actively generates predictions about what you'll see next. When reading, your brain predicts upcoming words based on context. In conversation, you begin formulating responses before others finish speaking. Even basic object perception involves prediction. You automatically anticipate how objects will move or respond to forces. Recent neuroscience frameworks like predictive processing suggest this future orientation fundamentally characterizes consciousness. Your brain continuously generates models of anticipated sensory input, comparing predictions with actual sensations and adjusting models to minimize prediction errors. What you consciously experience may represent your brain's predictions rather than raw sensory data. Some philosophical traditions suggest this predictive activity creates the subjective feeling of time flowing from past to future. Without anticipation, the present moment might not feel situated within temporal flow. Dreams particularly demonstrate consciousness's predictive nature. Despite their apparent spontaneity, dream narratives often anticipate and symbolically address future challenges. As sleep approaches, your consciousness gradually shifts temporal orientation. The future-directed planning of waking consciousness gives way to the more present-centered awareness of drowsiness before transforming into the alternative temporality of dreams. The unraveling thread. I am not alive, but I grow. I don't have lungs, but I need air. I don't have a mouth, but water kills me. What am I? Fire embodies this riddle's answer. It grows larger, requires oxygen, and extinguishes with water. This anthropomorphic description demonstrates how we understand phenomena through attributes normally associated with living organisms. Fire doesn't literally grow or breathe, yet these metaphors effectively communicate its behavior. Consciousness similarly gets described through metaphors. We speak of thoughts flowing, attention being focused, or memories being stored, attributing properties from physical domains to mental phenomena. These aren't merely linguistic conveniences, but shape how we conceptualize consciousness itself. The metaphor of consciousness as a spotlight highlights selectivity, but obscures how attention transforms what it illuminates. The metaphor of mind as a container suggests thoughts exist as objects within a mental space, potentially misleading our understanding of thought's nature. Some philosophers argue consciousness might be fundamentally metaphorical, not because language is insufficient, but because consciousness itself operates through metaphorical mapping between domains. This metaphorical nature appears vividly in dreams, where abstract concerns manifest as concrete scenarios and emotions appear as characters or settings. Even waking consciousness might be fundamentally metaphorical, translating information between neural, phenomenal, and conceptual domains through mappings that preserve relationships rather than literal content. As sleep approaches, your consciousness becomes increasingly metaphorical, with thoughts transforming into images and concepts into scenarios that will ultimately create the richly metaphorical landscape of dreams. The Forgotten Face. Mr. Smith has 4 daughters. Each of his daughters has a brother. How many children does Mr. Smith have? The answer is 5. 4 daughters and 1 son who is brother to each daughter. This riddle misdirects by suggesting each daughter has a different brother. This demonstrates our tendency toward multiplicative rather than shared relationships when not specified otherwise. Similar cognitive tendencies affect consciousness research. We often implicitly assume one-to-one relationships between neural and mental states, overlooking how the same neural activity might participate in different conscious experiences, depending on broader patterns of brain activation. Likewise, we tend to think of consciousness as a singular phenomenon rather than considering it might comprise multiple distinct processes sharing resources. Recent theories like global workspace or integrated information suggest consciousness emerges from shared information distribution across brain regions. A specific conscious experience might not correspond to activity in dedicated consciousness neurons, but instead emerge from how information is shared and integrated across distributed networks. Some philosophical traditions similarly propose consciousness isn't a specific thing or process, but a relational property. Perhaps information integration or global availability across cognitive systems. Dreams particularly demonstrate how the same basic neural building blocks can configure into dramatically different forms of consciousness than waking experience. As sleep approaches, your consciousness gradually reconfigures, maintaining many of the same basic neural ingredients while dramatically transforming their relationships to create the distinctive phenomenology of dreams. The Abandoned House. There is a house with 4 walls, each facing south. A bear walks by. What color is the bear? The bear must be white, a polar bear, because only at the North Pole could a house have all walls facing south. This spatial reasoning puzzle highlights how implicit assumptions often constrain problem solving. We automatically picture houses in familiar contexts rather than considering extreme possibilities like polar locations. Consciousness contains similar hidden assumptions. We typically assume awareness is confined to our heads, overlooks how perceptual experience might extend into the environment. The boundary between inside and outside consciousness may be less clear than intuitively assumed. Consider how smoothly visual perception incorporates external objects. You experience seeing trees directly rather than experiencing visual representations of trees in your mind. Some philosophers argue consciousness isn't contained in the brain, but extends into the environment through dynamic interaction. Others suggest the boundary between conscious and unconscious processing isn't sharp, but involves gradations of awareness. Dreams demonstrate consciousness operating without external input, yet creating experiences that seem environmentally situated. This suggests consciousness fundamentally involves constructing a sense of spatial position, even when no actual external positioning exists. As sleep approaches, your spatial assumptions gradually transform. The clear boundary between self and environment that characterizes waking consciousness becomes more permeable. This transition reveals how many features of consciousness we take as fundamental may actually be specific to particular states rather than essential to consciousness itself. The Hollow Mountain. What has a heart that doesn't beat? Artichokes, playing cards, or metaphorical expressions like the heart of the mountain all answer this riddle by extending the concept heart beyond its biological meaning to central regions of various objects. This semantic extension demonstrates how concepts stretch beyond literal meanings through metaphor and analogy. Consciousness similarly extends through metaphorical mapping. We understand abstract domains through concrete experiences, comprehending time through spatial movement, importance through size, affection through warmth. These aren't mere linguistic flourishes, but fundamental cognitive mechanisms. even scientific concepts depend on metaphorical extension. We describe electrons as particles or waves, despite their behavior transcending familiar macroscopic objects. Consciousness itself eludes literal description, requiring metaphors like spotlight of attention or stream of consciousness that highlight certain aspects while inevitably distorting others. Some traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally operates through such metaphorical extension, creating understanding by mapping relationships from known domains onto unknown ones, preserving structural patterns rather than surface similarities. Dreams particularly demonstrate this metaphorical nature, translating abstract concerns into concrete scenarios and emotional states into environmental conditions. As sleep approaches, your cognition becomes increasingly metaphorical. Literal, logical thought gives way to associative connections based on structural or emotional similarities rather than literal relationships, creating the metaphorically rich landscape that characterizes dream consciousness. The silent musician. What instrument can you hear but never see? The answer is your voice, audible yet invisible to its owner. This self-referential riddle highlights the peculiar asymmetry in experiencing our own existence. You directly experience your thoughts, emotions, and sensations, yet this first-person perspective creates blind spots. You can't observe your own face without mirrors, can't hear your voice as others do, and can't directly examine many aspects of your own consciousness. Neuroscience reveals further asymmetries. Your brain contains no pain receptors. The organ enabling pain awareness feels no pain itself. You cannot directly observe your own brain activity, generating consciousness, creating an explanatory gap between subjective experience and its physical basis. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness necessarily involves such blind spots. The witnessing capacity of awareness cannot simultaneously be its own object, just as an eye cannot see itself directly. Various contemplative traditions approach this limitation differently. Some develop meta-awareness, the capacity to observe mental processes as if from outside. Others suggest transcending the subject-object framework entirely through non-dual awareness that allegedly overcomes the limitation of consciousness being unable to observe itself directly. Dreams represent another approach to self-awareness. In lucid dreaming, consciousness observes itself dreaming, creating a peculiar self-referential loop impossible in ordinary perception. As sleep approaches, your capacity for meta-awareness gradually diminishes. The observing function of consciousness that can monitor its own processes in wakefulness fades first, while primary awareness persists longer before transforming into dream consciousness. The weightless stone. What stone can never be found in the sea? A dry stone provides this riddle's answer. Definitionally impossible, since the sea would wet any stone within it. This riddle works through conceptual contradiction rather than factual obscurity. Similar conceptual contradictions appear throughout philosophical investigations of consciousness. Consider attempting to imagine what it's like to be unconscious. The very attempt creates a paradox. Consciousness trying to imagine its own absence. Or consider trying to observe the exact moment you fall asleep. Success is impossible because the observation itself prevents the state being observed. Certain conscious states might be inherently inaccessible to reflection. Pure consciousness without objects, described in some contemplative traditions, allegedly cannot be conceptualized because conceptualization creates subject-object structure that contradicts the state itself. Another apparent contradiction involves the relationship between attention and consciousness. Some research suggests attention is necessary for consciousness, yet other findings indicate we can be conscious of stimuli we're not attending to. This apparent contradiction might indicate our concepts of attention and consciousness need refinement. Philosophy abounds with such conceptual puzzles about consciousness. The hard problem itself might represent a conceptual contradiction in how we frame the relationship between physical processes and subjective experience. As you drift toward sleep, notice how certain conscious states resist direct observation. The transition between wakefulness and sleep can never quite be witnessed, revealing how some aspects of consciousness operate beyond the reach of reflection. The broken record. What stays where it is when it goes off? The alarm clock answers this paradoxical riddle. Going off means activating rather than moving away, demonstrating how context determines meaning. Words lack intrinsic meaning, but acquire significance through usage contexts. Similarly, nervous system signals have no inherent meaning. The same electrochemical signals mean different things, depending on which neurons send them where. Signals from retinal cells mean light, because they connect to visual cortex, while identical electrochemical signals from cochlear cells mean sound, because they connect to auditory cortex. This context dependency extends throughout consciousness. Identical physical sensations feel different based on expectations and interpretations. The same pressure sensation is pleasurable during a massage, but uncomfortable during a medical examination. This reveals how consciousness involves interpretation, not just registration. Even basic perceptions require contextual processing. The same gray square appears darker or lighter depending on surrounding colors. Color constancy mechanisms adjust color perception based on lighting context. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally involves such contextual interpretation rather than direct apprehension. What we experience depends not just on what's present, but on how consciousness frames and interprets it. Dreams demonstrate this contextual nature dramatically. The same basic neural activity creates entirely different experiences depending on narrative context. As sleep approaches, your interpretive frameworks gradually shift. The strict logic of waking consciousness gives way to more fluid associations, where meaning depends increasingly on emotional and symbolic context, rather than literal interpretation. The Orphaned Book. I am the beginning of sorrow and the end of sickness. You cannot express happiness without me, yet I am in the midst of crosses. I am always in risk, yet never in danger. You may find me in the sun, but I am never seen in daylight. What am I? The letter S answers this lexical riddle. It begins sorrow, ends sickness, appears in happiness, crosses, and risk, etc. This demonstrates pattern recognition based on superficial features rather than meaning. Our brains excel at detecting patterns, sometimes finding them where none exist, as in pareidolia, seeing faces in random patterns, or apophenia, perceiving connections between unrelated phenomena. While sometimes misleading, this pattern-seeking drives scientific discovery and artistic creativity. Consciousness itself might represent a pattern recognition system that evolved to identify meaningful relationships in sensory data. However, this pattern-seeking creates illusions of understanding. We construct narratives that seem to explain phenomena by highlighting selected patterns, while ignoring contradictory information. Even scientific theories are vulnerable to confirmation bias, requiring rigorous testing to overcome our tendency to see only evidence supporting existing beliefs. Dreams particularly demonstrate consciousness's pattern-making nature, creating narrative coherence from random neural activation. Some neuroscientists suggest dream content might represent the brain's attempt to construct meaningful patterns from essentially random activation during REM sleep. As sleep approaches, your pattern seeking continues, organizing fragmentary thoughts and images into seemingly meaningful sequences that gradually transform into dream narratives. The Eternal Prison. A woman sits in her room at night. There is no light in the room, no lamp, no candle, nothing. Yet she is reading. How? The woman is blind and reading Braille, a solution that requires escaping the implicit assumption that reading involves sight. This demonstrates how unexamined assumptions can prevent considering valid possibilities. Similar implicit assumptions constrain how we think about consciousness. We typically assume consciousness requires a brain, overlooking theoretical possibilities like artificial consciousness in non-neural systems, or panpsychist views that consciousness might exist to some degree in all physical systems. We assume consciousness evolved for survival advantages, potentially missing how aspects of awareness might be byproducts rather than adaptations. We assume consciousness must be either physical or non-physical, overlooking potential categories beyond this dichotomy. Some philosophical traditions specifically target these implicit assumptions about consciousness. Contemplative practices attempt to suspend ordinary conceptual frameworks to experience awareness without usual interpretive overlays. Various thought experiments challenge assumptions about consciousness by imagining scenarios that test conceptual boundaries. philosophical zombies physically identical to humans, but lacking consciousness, brain bisection cases where consciousness might split, or gradual neuron replacement scenarios questioning whether consciousness could transfer to artificial substrates. As sleep approaches, notice how many waking assumptions about consciousness naturally suspend. The clear distinction between imagination and perception blurs. The sense of being a separate observer gradually dissolves. These transitions reveal how many seemingly fundamental features of consciousness might actually represent specific state-dependent configurations rather than essential properties. The unattainable star. I am a star with 5 points. I'm never above you, always beneath you. What am I? A starfish answers this riddle, found on the ocean floor, never in the sky. This demonstrates how context shifts meaning. The same word, star, signifies dramatically different objects depending on context. Similar context dependency characterizes consciousness. The identical physical sensation feels radically different when interpreted as pain versus pleasure, as intentionally versus accidentally inflicted, or as temporary versus permanent. Neuroscience reveals how top-down processes constantly shape experience based on context. Your visual system fills in your blind spot based on surrounding context. Your auditory system uses contextual cues to distinguish phonemes in noisy environments. This contextual nature explains many phenomena, including placebo effects. Context creates actual pain relief. Priming effects, prior context influences perception. And framing effects, how options are presented affects decisions. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally involves such contextual framing rather than direct perception. What we experience depends not just on sensory input, but on how consciousness contextualizes it within conceptual, emotional, and memory frameworks. Dreams demonstrate this dramatically. The same basic neural activity creates radically different experiences depending on narrative context. As sleep approaches, your contextual frameworks gradually shift. Sensations, thoughts, and images that would have specific interpretations in waking consciousness acquire new meanings as context shifts from logical waking frameworks to the more fluid, emotionally driven contexts of hypnagogic consciousness, and eventually, dreams. The silent orchestra. What kind of band never plays music? Rubber bands, headbands, or wedding bands answer this riddle through semantic extension. The word band applies to diverse objects sharing minimal common features. Roughly, things that encircle or bind. This demonstrates how categorization often works through family resemblance, rather than strict necessary and sufficient conditions. Members of a category may share overlapping features without any single feature being essential to category membership. Consciousness research involves similar categorization challenges. What exactly counts as consciousness? Should we include dream states, minimal awareness during deep sleep, or altered states from meditation or psychedelics? Are insects conscious? What about artificial intelligence systems? No single criterion seems both necessary and sufficient for consciousness attribution. Some philosophers suggest consciousness might not represent a natural kind with clear boundaries, but a cluster concept covering related phenomena with family resemblances. Others propose consciousness exists on continuums of degree, type, or complexity, rather than being discretely present or absent. Various researchers operationalize consciousness differently, as reportability, as information integration, as metacognitive access, or as phenomenal experience, leading to different conclusions about its nature and distribution. As sleep approaches, you experience firsthand how consciousness exists on continuums rather than in discrete states. The transition from wakefulness through drowsiness to sleep involves gradual shifts along multiple dimensions: alertness, metacognition, perceptual clarity, logical coherence, revealing consciousness's spectral rather than binary nature. The infinite forest. How many seconds are there in 1 year? The answer, 12, the second of each month, humorously reinterprets seconds as calendar positions rather than time units. This linguistic ambiguity demonstrates how the same word can designate entirely different concepts, depending on interpretation context. Similar ambiguities plague consciousness research. Terms like consciousness, awareness, mind, and attention carry multiple meanings across disciplines and traditions. When researchers debate whether consciousness is in the head or extends into the environment, they often speak past each other by using the same term differently. Even qualia, supposedly referring to the subjective, qualitative aspects of experience, gets defined variously as what it's like to have an experience, as the intrinsic, non-representational properties of experience, or as the ineffable, introspectively accessible properties of experience. These aren't merely semantic disagreements, but reflect fundamental conceptual differences about consciousness's nature. Some philosophers argue these terminological ambiguities fundamentally constrain consciousness research. Without clear consensus on what we're studying, investigations proceed in parallel without genuine convergence. Different research programs may be studying different phenomena while using the same terminology, creating the illusion of addressing the same questions. As sleep approaches, notice how your own understanding of consciousness shifts. The clear, self-reflective awareness, characteristic of waking, gradually transforms into the more immediate, less metacognitive awareness of drowsiness, before transforming again into the distinctive phenomenology of dreams. The fading memory. What is 3/7 chicken, 2/3 cat, and 2/4 goat? The answer is Chicago. Chai appears in 3/7 of chicken, Ca appears in 2/3 of cat, and go appears in 2/4 of goat. This riddle works by decomposing and recombining elements across conceptual boundaries. Similar recombination appears in creative thinking, making connections between previously unrelated domains to generate novel insights. This recombinatorial nature extends to consciousness itself. Your conscious experience combines elements across sensory modalities, memory, emotion, and conceptual understanding to create unified experiences. Your perception of an apple integrates color, shape, texture, smell, taste, semantic knowledge, and personal associations into a coherent whole. Dreams particularly demonstrate consciousness's recombinatorial capacity, creating novel scenarios by joining elements from disparate experiences in ways that transcend waking logic. Some theories suggest consciousness evolved specifically for this integrative function, allowing organisms to combine information across domains for flexible problem solving. Modern approaches like global workspace theory propose consciousness works by broadcasting selected information throughout the brain, making it available for processing across multiple specialized systems. Integrated information theory similarly suggests consciousness correlates with a system's capacity to integrate information across its constituent parts. From this perspective, consciousness isn't a specific thing or process, but an emergent property of how information combines across specialized neural systems. As sleep approaches, your consciousness gradually shifts from the tightly constrained combinations of waking logic to the more fluid recombination of hypnagogic imagery that will eventually transform into the wildly recombinatorial landscape of dreams. The unknowable face. What has a face and two hands but no arms or legs? A clock provides this riddle's answer, something with face and hands that aren't bodily parts. This anthropomorphic language demonstrates how we understand objects through bodily metaphors. We speak of clock faces, table, legs, chair, arms, and mountain, feet, mapping bodily features onto inanimate objects. This embodied cognition extends beyond language into how we think. Abstract concepts like time, looking forward to tomorrow, importance, big issues, and emotional states, feeling down, are understood through bodily-based metaphors. Some cognitive scientists argue this embodiment isn't merely linguistic, but fundamental to thought itself. Abstract understanding develops through mapping patterns from physical experience to non-physical domains. Consciousness research increasingly recognizes this embodied nature. Rather than viewing consciousness as abstract information, processing happening incidentally in a body, embodied cognition suggests awareness fundamentally depends on and emerges from physical embodiment. The specific form of human consciousness reflects our particular bodily configuration, our sensory systems, motor capabilities, and interoceptive awareness. But some philosophers argue consciousness extends beyond the brain to include bodily processes and even interactions with the environment. Dreams illustrate this embodiment paradoxically. While physically immobile, dream consciousness often involves intense bodily experiences, suggesting consciousness maintains embodied structure even without current sensory input. As sleep approaches, bodily awareness transforms, but doesn't disappear. The sharp boundary between body and world that characterizes waking consciousness softens. Physical sensations like heaviness, floating, or falling often accompany sleep onset, demonstrating how consciousness remains embodied even as it transitions between states. The darkest light. I exist only when there is light, but direct light kills me. What am I? A shadow answers this paradoxical riddle, existing through light yet defined by its absence. This captures something essential about consciousness. It often involves the interplay between presence and absence, between what's attended and what's ignored. Your conscious vision doesn't represent a complete image of visual space. It contains scotomas, blind spots you don't normally notice because your visual system fills them in. Attention operates similarly. By highlighting certain contents, it necessarily relegates others to the periphery, or excludes them entirely. This interplay between presence and absence extends beyond perception. Your memory doesn't store complete experiences, but selective highlights, with recall involving reconstruction rather than retrieval. Language works through differentiation. Words gain meaning not just through what they designate, but through contrast with what they don't designate. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally involves such interplay between presence and absence. Sartre proposed, consciousness is characterized by nothingness, the capacity to negate what is and imagine what isn't. Buddhist traditions emphasize how awareness depends on contrast, with distinctions creating the conditions for conscious experience. Dreams demonstrate this interplay dramatically, creating vivid presences from neural activity, while simultaneously generating absences through sensory disconnection and logical constraint deactivation. As sleep approaches, notice how consciousness begins emphasizing different presences and absences. External perception fades, while internal imagery becomes more prominent. The sharp boundary between perception and imagination that defines waking consciousness gradually dissolves, revealing how consciousness always involves a dynamic interplay between what's present and what's absent. The reign of shadows. The more you have of me, the less you see. What am I? Darkness answers this accumulative riddle. As darkness increases, visibility decreases. This inverse relationship highlights how consciousness often involves trade-offs rather than simple accumulation. Your attention works this way. Focusing on one aspect of experience necessarily reduces awareness of others. The cocktail party effect demonstrates this. Concentrating on one conversation makes other nearby conversations less consciously available. Similar trade-offs appear throughout cognition. Working memory can hold more items by reducing precision, or fewer items with greater detail. Visual perception trades color sensitivity for edge detection in low light. Even creativity shows this pattern. Divergent thinking, generating many ideas, trades off against convergent thinking, refining specific solutions. Some theories suggest consciousness evolved specifically to manage such trade-offs adaptively. By selecting certain information for global availability while inhibiting other processes, consciousness creates coherent behavior from potentially competing neural systems. Rather than processing all available information simultaneously, the brain selectively amplifies relevant signals while dampening others. This selection process creates both the focused quality of consciousness and its limitations. Dreams demonstrate different trade-offs than waking consciousness. While logically and perceptually constrained, dreams often show enhanced emotional intensity and creative association. As sleep approaches, your consciousness gradually shifts its characteristic trade-offs. The sharp focus of waking attention broadens into the more diffuse awareness of drowsiness. External sensitivity decreases while internal imagery increases. These shifting trade-offs reveal consciousness's fundamentally selective nature as it transitions between states with different information processing priorities. The empty vessel. I have holes on the top and bottom. I have holes on my left and on my right, and I have holes in the middle, yet I still hold water. What am I? A sponge answers this paradoxical riddle, something that contains more absence than presence, yet still functions effectively. This seemingly contradictory nature appears throughout consciousness. Your visual field contains a blind spot where the optic nerve connects, yet you never notice this absence in ordinary perception. Your attention constantly shifts between objects, creating discontinuous awareness that nevertheless feels continuous. Your working memory holds only a few items simultaneously, yet creates the impression of comprehensive understanding. Some traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally involves such generative absence. The Taoist concept of wu, emptiness, proposes that utility often emerges from what isn't there. The empty space inside a cup creates its usefulness. Similarly, consciousness might derive its capacity not from what it contains, but from what it excludes, creating functional space through selective inhibition. Modern neuroscience partially supports this view. Consciousness correlates not just with neural activation, but with specific inhibitory patterns that create differentiated information states. Dreams dramatically demonstrate how absence creates possibility. By disconnecting from external sensory constraints and inhibiting certain prefrontal regions, dream consciousness gains creative freedom impossible during waking. The absence of logical constraints enables impossible scenarios. The absence of motor execution enables imagined movement without physical action. As sleep approaches, your consciousness creates new possibilities through progressive absence. As external awareness diminishes and logical constraints relax, consciousness doesn't simply reduce, but transforms, generating hypnagogic imagery and fluid associations that eventually develop into the rich phenomenology of dreams. The invisible wall. You're in a room with 3 light switches, each corresponding to one of 3 bulbs in an adjacent room you cannot see into. All are initially off. You may flip the switches as many times as you like, but can only enter the adjacent room once. How can you determine which switch corresponds to which bulb? The solution uses heat as an information channel. Turn on switch 1 for several minutes, then turn it off. Turn on switch 2 and leave it on. Enter the room. The bulb that's on corresponds to switch 2. The warm but off bulb corresponds to switch 1. The cool off bulb corresponds to switch 3. This demonstrates how seemingly insufficient information can yield complete solutions through creative use of unexpected properties. Consciousness researchers face similar informational constraints. Subjective experience remains private. We cannot directly observe another's consciousness. However, by leveraging multiple information channels, verbal reports, behavioral responses, physiological measurements, and brain imaging, researchers can make sophisticated inferences about consciousness, states otherwise inaccessible to observation. The mismatch between what we can directly observe, brain activity, behavior, and what we want to understand, subjective experience, creates the explanatory gap that philosophers find so challenging. Some suggest this gap is merely practical. We lack sufficient measurement tools. Others argue it's principled. Subjective experience cannot, even in theory, be fully captured through objective measurement. As you drift towards sleep, your own consciousness becomes progressively less reportable. The clear, communicable awareness of waking gradually transforms into experiences that would be difficult or impossible to accurately report, revealing the mismatch between consciousness as experienced and consciousness as measurable from outside. The circular path. What English word retains the same pronunciation even after you take away 4 of its 5 letters? The answer is Q. Remove all but the first letter Q, and the pronunciation remains unchanged. This phonological curiosity demonstrates how language creates arbitrary relationships between symbols and sounds that persist despite substantial transformation. Consciousness, similarly, maintains certain qualities across dramatic transformations. Despite substantial differences between waking, dreaming, and meditative states, something recognizable as consciousness persists across these variations. This continuity across transformation raises philosophical questions about consciousness's essential nature. What core features must remain for something to count as consciousness? Various traditions propose different answers. Some suggest awareness itself, the capacity for experience, constitutes consciousness's essence, regardless of specific contents. Others argue consciousness necessarily involves reflexivity, awareness that includes awareness of itself. Still, others suggest intentionality, The quality of being about something defines consciousness, essentially. Dreams provide interesting test cases for these theories. Dream consciousness lacks the reflective awareness and logical consistency of waking consciousness, yet maintains the phenomenological quality of experience. Certain meditative states allegedly involve contentless awareness, consciousness without specific objects, challenging views that consciousness necessarily involves intentionality. As sleep approaches, notice which aspects of your consciousness transform and which persist. The specific contents of awareness change dramatically, but something recognizable as consciousness continues, despite these transformations, potentially revealing which features might constitute consciousness's essential nature versus its state-specific manifestations. The vanishing image. What disappears as soon as you say its name? Silence provides this riddle's elegant answer. The mere act of naming silence destroys what's named. This self-referential paradox parallels similar phenomena in consciousness. Certain mental states transform when explicitly noticed. When you suddenly become aware you're daydreaming, the daydream often ends. Flow states, periods of complete absorption in an activity, frequently terminate when you notice you're experiencing them. The process of observing consciousness changes the consciousness being observed. Meditation traditions systematically explore this observer effect. Practitioners report that sustained attention on thoughts or emotions transforms these experiences, often diminishing their intensity or revealing their constructed nature. Some traditions explicitly work with states that allegedly cannot be observed as objects because observation itself is their fundamental nature. Scientific study of consciousness faces similar challenges. The act of measuring consciousness potentially alters what's being measured. Asking subjects to report on their experiences may change those very experiences. Even brain imaging studies may capture different neural correlates depending on whether subjects consciously monitor their experiences. Consciousness might be uniquely elusive in this regard. The very act of scientific observation becomes part of what's observed. As sleep approaches, the transition moment between wakefulness and sleep demonstrates this principle perfectly. The more you try to observe the exact moment of falling asleep, the more that very observation prevents the transition it attempts to witness, revealing consciousness's capacity to transform through processes that resist direct observation. The unlockable door. What can you hold in your right hand, but not in your left? Your left hand answers this bodily riddle. This self-referential puzzle highlights how conscious experience necessarily involves perspective. You can observe your left hand as an object from your embodied perspective, but that same perspective prevents you from seeing your left hand as you see your right. This perspectival nature extends throughout consciousness. Your experience always comes from somewhere, a particular viewpoint with its own limitations and possibilities. This first-person perspective creates fundamental asymmetries in knowledge. You know your own thoughts and feelings directly, while others' mental states must be inferred. You cannot see your own face without mirrors, but can directly observe others. Some philosophical traditions suggest this perspectival quality fundamentally defines consciousness. Thomas Nagel famously argued consciousness essentially involves what it is like to be something, a subjective perspective that cannot be fully captured through objective description. This creates the explanatory gap between third-person accounts of brain processes and first-person experiences that philosophers find so challenging. Various contemplative traditions attempt to transcend ordinary perspective through meditation practices allegedly producing non-dual awareness, consciousness without the usual subject-object distinction. Whether such experiences truly transcend perspective or simply create alternative perspectives remains debated. Dreams demonstrate consciousness's flexibility in creating perspective. You can experience impossible viewpoints, seeing yourself from outside or occupying multiple perspectives simultaneously. As sleep approaches, your ordinary waking perspective gradually transforms, revealing consciousness's capacity to generate alternative viewpoints beyond the constraints of physical embodiment. The weightless gold. What gets heavier when it's empty? Your heart provides one answer to this emotional riddle, becoming heavy with sadness when emptied of joy. This metaphorical weight highlights how consciousness extends beyond literal physical properties into emotional and metaphorical dimensions. Your experience contains not just sensory qualities, but emotional textures that fundamentally shape how reality appears to you. When anxious, the world seems threatening. When depressed, it appears meaningless. When joyful, it looks full of possibility. These emotional qualities aren't merely added to perception, but constitute how things appear in conscious experience. Some theories suggest emotions primarily evolved as specialized modes of perception, ways of seeing the world in terms of threat, opportunity, or social significance. Rather than seeing emotions as separate from cognition, this view suggests emotions fundamentally shape cognitive processing. The philosophical tradition of phenomenology particularly emphasizes how mood constitutes the background against which all experience occurs. Heidegger discussed how moods attune us to the world, making certain aspects salient while obscuring others. This emotional dimension creates consciousness's rich texture beyond mere information processing. Dreams particularly demonstrate consciousness's emotional nature. Dream content often reflects emotional concerns rather than literal experiences, suggesting emotions may drive dream generation more than cognitive processing. As sleep approaches, notice how emotional tone influences consciousness's transformation. Anxiety can prevent sleep by maintaining vigilance. Contentment facilitates the transition by allowing surrender of control. The frozen time. 2 fathers and 2 sons go fishing. They catch 3 fish in total, yet each person gets a whole fish. How is this possible? The answer involves 3 people: a grandfather, his son, and his grandson. The grandfather is a father, his son is both a father and a son, and his grandson is a son. This relational riddle demonstrates how the same individual can simultaneously occupy multiple categories depending on perspective. Identity isn't singular, but relational. We are different things to different people simultaneously. Consciousness similarly involves multiple simultaneous identities. Your conscious experience includes being both the subject who experiences and an object in the world experienced by others. You are simultaneously the observer of your thoughts and the thinker producing them. Some philosophical traditions emphasize this dual nature of consciousness. Sartre distinguished between pre-reflective consciousness, direct awareness, and reflective consciousness, awareness of being aware. In pre-reflective consciousness, you're absorbed in experience. In reflective consciousness, you become aware of yourself as the experiencer. Dreams demonstrate even more dramatic multiplicity. In dreams, you are simultaneously the experiencer of the dream, a character within the dream, and in some sense, the creator of the dream content. This multiplicity challenges simplistic models of consciousness as a unified observer separate from its contents. As sleep approaches, your sense of unified identity gradually loosens. The clear boundary between self and world that characterizes waking consciousness becomes more permeable. This transition reveals how unified selfhood may be a specific achievement of waking consciousness rather than a fundamental feature of awareness itself. The seamless web. It belongs to you, but other people use it more than you do. What is it? Your name answers this social riddle. Though fundamentally linked to your identity, your name functions primarily as a tool for others to identify and refer to you. This highlights the intersubjective nature of selfhood. Your identity exists not just in private experience, but in social recognition. Consciousness similarly extends beyond individual boundaries into social dimensions. From early development, consciousness forms through interaction. Infant consciousness emerges through caregiver mirroring, where expressions and emotions gain meaning through social reflection. Language acquisition further shapes consciousness through socially defined symbols that structure thought and perception. Some theories suggest consciousness evolved primarily for social coordination rather than individual cognition. The ability to model others' minds and navigate complex social hierarchies may have driven the evolution of self-awareness. By representing ourselves as social actors, we gain advantages in predicting others' responses to our behavior. This social dimension explains certain features of consciousness that seem unnecessary for individual problem solving, such as our preoccupation with social evaluation and status. Dreams frequently reflect this social nature, often featuring interpersonal scenarios that process social concerns and relationships. Even in sleep, consciousness remains fundamentally social in its content and structure. As you drift toward sleep, notice how social dimensions of consciousness transform. The socially constructed self that maintains consistent presentation in waking life loosens its constraints. The dreams that follow often explore social scenarios impossible in waking life, revealing how consciousness continues processing social information even when disconnected from actual social interaction. The unborn child. Feed me and I live, give me water and I die. What am I? Fire answers this elemental riddle. This conditional existence, thriving with one input yet perishing with another, highlights how consciousness similarly depends on specific conditions. Your awareness requires precise physiological parameters to maintain its waking form. Too little glucose, oxygen, or proper neurotransmitter balance, and consciousness transforms or disappears. Yet unlike fire, which simply extinguishes, consciousness demonstrates remarkable state transitions. When environmental conditions shift beyond certain parameters, consciousness doesn't simply vanish, but transforms into altered states, sleep, dreams, or in extreme cases, near-death experiences reported by those who survive clinical death. This adaptability suggests consciousness may be more fundamental than its specific manifestations. Some philosophical traditions propose consciousness continues through death, not as personal identity, but as a fundamental quality that takes new forms, just as energy transforms rather than disappears. Modern scientific perspectives generally reject such continuity, viewing consciousness as emergent from and dependent upon specific brain states. However, the dramatic transformations consciousness undergoes between waking, dreaming, and deep sleep reveal its remarkable flexibility in creating entirely different phenomenological landscapes from varying neural conditions. As you approach sleep, your consciousness begins its nightly transformation. Rather than simply diminishing, awareness reconfigures. External perception fades while internal imagery intensifies. Logical constraints relax, while associative processing increases. Self-reflective awareness diminishes while primary consciousness continues. This transformation reveals consciousness's conditional nature, not just as presence versus absence, but as different manifestations under different conditions. The forgotten memory. I am light as a feather, yet no man can hold me for long. What am I? Your breath answers this physiological riddle. Though seemingly insubstantial, breath proves impossible to maintain in a single state. It must rhythmically alternate between inhalation and exhalation. This rhythmic necessity parallels how consciousness pulses between different states and focuses. Your attention naturally oscillates rather than maintaining fixed focus. Even when concentrating on a single object, attention microscopically fluctuates, preventing perceptual fading. Neural studies show attention oscillates at specific frequencies, creating rhythmic sampling of the environment rather than continuous monitoring. This pulsing quality extends beyond attention to awareness more broadly. Consciousness flows between external and internal focus, between conceptual and perceptual processing, between broad awareness and narrow concentration. Some contemplative traditions explicitly recognize this fluctuating nature, teaching practitioners to rest in the spaces between thoughts, rather than attempting to hold awareness perfectly still. The breath itself has served as a meditation object across traditions, precisely because its rhythmic nature mirrors consciousness's own pulsation. Sleep cycles demonstrate consciousness's larger rhythmic nature. Throughout the night, your consciousness cycles between different sleep stages, each with distinct phenomenological and neurological characteristics. Even within dream periods, consciousness oscillates between greater and lesser lucidity. As sleep approaches, your consciousness begins its nightly rhythm shift. The rapid fluctuations of waking attention gradually transform into the slower oscillations of drowsiness, and eventually the distinctive rhythms of sleep stages, revealing consciousness's fundamentally pulsatile rather than static nature. The unbroken promise. What building has the most stories? A library answers this narrative riddle. Beyond its literal meaning, this wordplay highlights how consciousness fundamentally involves narrative. Your mind doesn't just register isolated experiences, but constantly weaves events into coherent stories. Memory works narratively, organizing experiences into causally connected sequences rather than isolated moments. Your sense of self emerges from autobiographical narratives that connect past experiences to present identity and future possibilities. This narrative quality extends beyond explicit storytelling into the basic structure of consciousness. Even perception involves implicit narratives. You don't see isolated visual frames, but continuous sequences that imply causal relations. When viewing simple geometric shapes moving on a screen, you automatically perceive them as chasing or helping each other, imposing narrative interpretations on basic motion. Some philosophers suggest consciousness essentially involves such narrative construction, creating meaningful sequences from otherwise disconnected events. This narrative capacity allows humans to transcend immediate experience, connecting past and future through imagination and planning. Dreams particularly demonstrate consciousness's narrative drive. Even from fragmented neural activation, the dreaming brain constructs storylines, characters, and scenarios with beginning, middle, and end structures. This suggests narrative organization may be fundamental to how consciousness functions, rather than merely a cultural overlay. As sleep approaches, notice how narrative thinking transforms. The directed, purpose-driven narratives of waking consciousness gradually shift toward the more associative, emotionally driven narratives of hypnagogic imagery that eventually develop into full dream stories. The shapeless form. What is it that given one, you'll have either two or none? A choice presents this riddle's answer. Making one choice eliminates other possibilities. This binary reduction, creating two potential outcomes or removing all options, captures something essential about consciousness. Your awareness inherently involves selection, highlighting certain contents while excluding others. Attention operates as a selective mechanism, enhancing processing of chosen stimuli, while inhibiting processing of competing information. This selective nature creates consciousness's distinctive focused quality, but also imposes limitations. By selecting certain aspects of experience for awareness, consciousness necessarily leaves others unnoticed. Inattentional blindness experiments dramatically demonstrate this. When attending to one task, observers often miss otherwise obvious events like gorillas walking through basketball games. Some theories suggest consciousness evolved specifically for this selective function. In a brain with billions of neurons processing information simultaneously, consciousness creates coherent behavior by selecting specific information for global availability while inhibiting potentially competing processes. Rather than trying to process all available information simultaneously, consciousness highlights what's currently most relevant for survival, reproduction, or goal achievement. Dreams involve different selection parameters than waking consciousness. While less constrained by sensory input and logic, dreams still involve selective processes, often highlighting emotional concerns while excluding abstract reasoning. As sleep approaches, selection processes gradually shift. The voluntary, goal-directed selection of waking attention gives way to more passive, association-driven selection processes that will ultimately generate dream content, revealing different modes of conscious selection across states. The eternal question. I have branches but no fruit, trunk, or leaves. What am I? A bank answers this financial riddle, though a river system, family tree, or even computer code equally satisfy the description. This metaphorical extension demonstrates how we understand abstract domains through concrete physical properties. Financial institutions aren't literal trees, yet we comprehend their organizational structure through botanical metaphors. This metaphorical cognition extends throughout consciousness. We understand time through spatial metaphors, looking forward to events, leaving memories behind. Importance through size, big questions, small concerns. And emotional states through physical sensations, warm feelings, heavy heart. Cognitive linguists like Lakoff and Johnson argue these aren't merely linguistic flourishes, but reveal how embodied experience fundamentally structures abstract thinking. Even mathematics, seemingly pure abstraction, builds on physical intuitions about collections, movements, and containment. Consciousness itself gets understood through metaphors. Attention as a spotlight, memory as storage, thought as internal speech. These aren't arbitrary comparisons, but shape how we conceptualize our own awareness. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness might be fundamentally metaphorical, creating understanding by mapping patterns across domains. Dreams particularly demonstrate this metaphorical nature, translating abstract concerns into concrete scenarios and emotional states into physical conditions. As sleep approaches, your thinking becomes increasingly metaphorical. Abstract concepts transform into concrete imagery. Thoughts manifest as sensory experiences, creating the richly metaphorical landscape that characterizes dream consciousness. The unwritten page. When is a door not a door? When it's ajar. This simple pun works through linguistic ambiguity. Ajar sounds like ajar, while actually meaning partially open. Beyond wordplay, this riddle demonstrates category boundaries' flexibility. Objects maintain identity despite state changes. A door remains a door whether open or closed. Similarly, consciousness maintains continuity despite dramatic state variations. Your awareness persists across waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and back to waking, somehow maintaining something recognizable as your consciousness despite these transformations. This continuity puzzles philosophers. What exactly persists across such different states? It can't be specific contents, as these change dramatically. It can't be self-reflection, which disappears in deep sleep. Some suggest a basic capacity for experience persists, even when specific contents and self-awareness vanish. Others propose consciousness itself fundamentally involves such state transitions rather than any single state. From this perspective, consciousness isn't defined by particular contents, but by the capacity for transformation between different modes of awareness. Local Eastern contemplative traditions often emphasize this transformative quality. Rather than identifying consciousness with any specific state, they teach practitioners to recognize awareness moving through different conditions while maintaining its essential nature. Dreams dramatically demonstrate this transformative capacity. Consciousness creates entirely different phenomenal worlds from waking while maintaining something recognizable as awareness. As sleep approaches, you experience this transformation directly. Your consciousness doesn't simply diminish, but reconfigures. External awareness fades while internal imagery intensifies. Logical constraints relax, while associative processing increases, revealing consciousness's remarkable capacity for metamorphosis. The inaudible whisper. What has 13 hearts but no other organs? A deck of playing cards answers this object riddle, reminding us how the same word, heart, can designate entirely different concepts depending on context. This semantic flexibility demonstrates how meaning depends on interpretive frameworks rather than fixed correspondence. Similarly, consciousness interprets the same signals differently depending on context. The identical physical sensation feels pleasant or unpleasant depending on surrounding circumstances. The same visual input generates different perceptions depending on expectations and attention. This interpretive nature extends throughout conscious experience. Your brain doesn't passively record reality, but actively constructs perceptions based on sensory signals, prior knowledge, current goals, and expectations. The color you perceive depends not just on wavelengths reaching your eyes, but on surrounding colors, lighting conditions, and even language categories. What you hear depends not just on sound waves, but on attention, expectation, and linguistic processing. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally involves such interpretation rather than direct perception. Rather than accessing reality directly, we experience our interpretation of reality, a model constructed by the brain based on limited information. Dreams particularly demonstrate consciousness's interpretive nature. The same basic neural activation can generate dramatically different experiences depending on how the dreaming mind interprets it. As sleep approaches, your interpretive frameworks gradually shift. The logical, practical interpretations of waking consciousness give way to more fluid, emotionally driven interpretations that will ultimately create the distinctive phenomenology of dreams, revealing how consciousness involves not just content, but interpretive processes that vary across states. The constant river. What runs but never walks, murmurs but never talks, has a bed but never sleeps, has a mouth but never eats. A river embodies this metaphorical riddle, described through anthropomorphic properties it doesn't literally possess. This metaphorical description demonstrates how we understand natural phenomena through bodily mappings. Rivers don't literally run or murmur, yet these metaphors effectively communicate their movement and sound. Consciousness similarly gets described through embodied metaphors. We speak of grasping ideas, thoughts flowing, or awareness being focused, applying physical actions to mental phenomena. These aren't merely linguistic conveniences, but shape how we conceptualize our own experience. The metaphor of consciousness as a stream emphasizes its continuous, flowing quality, but potentially obscures its constructive, selective aspects. The metaphor of mind as a container holding thoughts suggests mental contents exist as objects within a mental space, potentially misconstruing thought's actual nature. Some philosophical traditions suggest these metaphors fundamentally shape, rather than merely describe, consciousness. By conceptualizing awareness through embodied metaphors, we may create the very structures we then experience as inherent to consciousness itself. Alternative metaphors might reveal different aspects of consciousness currently hidden by conventional conceptualizations. Dreams demonstrate consciousness's metaphorical nature vividly. In dreams, abstract concerns manifest as concrete scenarios. Emotions appear as environments or characters, creating symbolic landscapes that translate meaning across domains. As sleep approaches, your consciousness becomes increasingly metaphorical. Abstract thoughts transform into sensory imagery, concepts into scenarios, creating the richly metaphorical dream consciousness that processes experience through symbolic rather than literal representation. The blinding light. During what month do people sleep the least? February. It has the fewest days. This calendar wordplay reminds us how questions can mislead through ambiguity. When asked about sleeping least, we automatically interpret this as sleeping fewest hours per night, rather than fewest total hours per month. This demonstrates how context shapes interpretation. The same question means different things in different frameworks. Consciousness similarly depends on interpretive contexts. The identical sensory data generates different perceptions depending on surrounding context. A gray square appears lighter against a dark background than against a light one. The same ambiguous image appears as different objects depending on conceptual priming. This contextual nature extends throughout conscious experience. Your emotional reaction to events depends not just on what happens, but on expectations, social norms, and personal history. Your understanding of language depends on surrounding words, speaker intentions, and social contexts. Some theories suggest consciousness fundamentally involves such contextual processing rather than direct registration. Your experience represents your brain's best interpretation of sensory data within current contexts, not a direct recording of reality. Dreams dramatically demonstrate this contextual nature. The same basic neural activity creates entirely different experiences depending on narrative and emotional context. As sleep approaches, your contextual frameworks gradually shift. The practical, socially constrained contexts of waking consciousness give way to more personal, emotionally driven contexts that will ultimately generate dream experiences, revealing how consciousness always operates within interpretive frameworks that vary across states. The frozen moment. I pass before the sun but make no shadow. What am I? The wind provides this riddle's answer, something that moves through space yet casts no shadow because it lacks opacity. This apparent contradiction highlights how phenomena can be simultaneously present, yet undetectable through ordinary perception. Consciousness contains similar invisible presences. Your visual field includes a blind spot where the optic nerve connects to the retina, yet you never notice this absence in ordinary perception. Your attention constantly shifts between objects, creating discontinuous awareness that nevertheless feels continuous. These unnoticed aspects of experience remain invisible, not because they're absent, but because consciousness constructs the illusion of continuity and completeness. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally involves such constructed continuity. Rather than directly perceiving reality, we experience a model that fills gaps and creates coherence from fragmented information. This model normally serves us well, but creates vulnerability to illusions when the brain's predictions diverge from reality. Dreams demonstrate an even more dramatic construction of presence from absence. During REM sleep, the brain generates complete experiential worlds despite sensory disconnection from physical reality. As sleep approaches, notice how consciousness begins constructing presences that have no external correlates. Hypnagogic imagery creates visual experiences without visual input. Phantom sensations appear without physical causes. These constructed presences reveal how consciousness naturally generates experience, not just from sensory reception, but from internal processes that continue even as external input diminishes. The unseen dawn. What is it that no man wants to have, but no man wants to lose? A lawsuit provides one answer to this paradoxical riddle. This contradictory valuation, simultaneously unwanted, yet something one wouldn't want to lose once possessed, highlights how value judgments depend on perspective and context. Similarly, consciousness involves complex, sometimes contradictory valuations that defy simple, positive, and yet negative categorization. Consider how we simultaneously seek and avoid certain conscious states. We desire sleep, yet resist surrendering consciousness to it. We crave novel experiences, yet feel anxiety when confronting the unfamiliar. We value alert awareness, yet also seek states where self-consciousness diminishes, as in flow experiences or meditation. This ambivalence suggests consciousness doesn't operate on simple pleasure-pain axes, but involves multiple, sometimes competing valuation systems. Neuroscience reveals separate brain systems for wanting versus liking, explaining how we can desire experiences we don't enjoy, or enjoy experiences we don't desire. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally involves such valuation, ambivalence. Rather than simply seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, consciousness navigates complex preference landscapes where values shift depending on context and perspective. Dreams particularly demonstrate complex valuations, creating scenarios that elicit contradictory emotions: fascination alongside fear, attraction alongside revulsion. As sleep approaches, notice the ambivalence that often accompanies the transition. Part of you likely desires sleep, while another part resists surrendering waking consciousness, revealing how awareness inherently involves complex, sometimes contradictory valuations rather than simple preference hierarchies. The dancing flame. What is full of holes but still holds water? A sponge answers this paradoxical riddle. This apparent contradiction, something defined by absence yet functionally effective because of that absence, highlights how functionality sometimes emerges from what isn't there rather than what is. Consciousness contains similar generative absences. Your visual field includes a blind spot where the optic nerve connects, yet you never notice this absence in ordinary perception because your visual system fills it in. Your attention necessarily ignores most available information to focus on selected contents, yet this limitation enables effective action rather than hindering it. Some traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally involves such generative absence. Eastern concepts like wiyu, emptiness, propose that utility emerges from what isn't there. The empty space inside a vessel creates its usefulness. Similarly, consciousness might derive its capacity not from what it contains, but from what it excludes, creating functional space through selective inhibition. Modern neuroscience partially supports this view. Consciousness correlates not just with neural activation, but with specific inhibitory patterns that create differentiated information states. Dreams dramatically demonstrate how absence creates possibility. By disconnecting from external sensory constraints and inhibiting certain prefrontal regions, dream consciousness gains creative freedom impossible during waking. The absence of logical constraints enables impossible scenarios. The absence of motor execution enables imagined movement without physical action. As sleep approaches, your consciousness creates new possibilities through progressive absence. As external awareness diminishes and logical constraints relax, consciousness doesn't simply reduce but transforms, generating hypnagogic imagery and fluid associations that eventually develop into dreams. The hollow echo. Take one out and scratch my head. I am now black, but once was red. What am I? A match provides this transformational riddle's answer. Removing it from its box and striking it changes its color from red to black. This transformation through action highlights how entities change through interaction rather than existing as static objects. Consciousness similarly emerges through interaction rather than existing as a thing. Your awareness doesn't simply record reality, but emerges through dynamic engagement with the environment. Perception involves active exploration rather than passive reception. Eye movements continuously sample visual scenes. Attention shifts between aspects of experience. Prediction constantly runs ahead of sensation. This interactive nature extends throughout conscious experience. Memory doesn't merely retrieve stored information, but reconstructs it through present activity. Imagination doesn't access pre-existing possibilities, but actively generates them through current processes. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally involves such dynamic interaction rather than static representation. Enactivist approaches propose that consciousness emerges from sensoromotor engagement with the world, rather than happening exclusively inside the head. From this perspective, awareness isn't something you have, but something you do through interaction. Dreams demonstrate a different mode of conscious interaction, engagement with internally generated scenarios rather than external reality. This suggests consciousness's interactive nature persists even without external input. As sleep approaches, your mode of conscious interaction gradually shifts. The outward-directed, environmentally engaged consciousness of waking transforms into the inward-directed, self-contained interaction of dreaming, revealing how consciousness remains fundamentally interactive even as its engagement patterns transform across states. The eternal silence. A man describes his daughters by saying, "They are all blonde, but two, all brunette, but two, and all redheaded, but two." How many daughters does he have? 3, one of each hair color. This logic puzzle works through indirect description. Rather than stating directly, "I have one blonde, one brunette, and one redhead," the father describes what isn't true of each category. This demonstrates how negation sometimes communicates more precisely than direct assertion. Consciousness similarly involves defining through negation. Your sense of self partially emerges through distinguishing what you are from what you aren't. Your conscious concepts gain precision through boundaries with contrasting concepts. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness fundamentally involves such knowing through unknowing. Apophatic approaches describe ultimate reality through what it isn't rather than what it is. Meditation practices often involve via negativa, recognizing consciousness by systematically identifying what it isn't rather than directly grasping what it is. This negative approach addresses the self-reference problem in consciousness study. The observer cannot directly observe itself as an object, but can recognize itself through contrast with what it isn't. Dreams demonstrate consciousness defining itself through negation. Despite their apparent spontaneity, dreams often process identity through contrast, creating scenarios where the dreamer encounters what they're not, thereby defining what they are. As sleep approaches, notice how your sense of self gradually transforms through changing boundaries. The clear distinction between self and world that characterizes waking consciousness becomes more permeable. This transition reveals how consciousness always involves boundary setting that varies across states, rather than fixed categories of self and other. The unseeable color. You live in a one-story house made entirely of redwood. What color is your staircase? The answer? There is no staircase in a one-story house. Highlights how questions sometimes contain contradictory premises. This contradiction creates an impossible scenario, a one-story house with stairs. Consciousness contains similar contradictions. Consider the impossible task of observing yourself observing. While you can be aware of your perceptions and thoughts, you cannot simultaneously make this awareness itself an object of awareness without creating a new act of awareness, leading to infinite regression. This self-reference limitation appears throughout consciousness. You cannot directly observe the process of falling asleep. The observation itself prevents what it attempts to observe. You cannot experience what it's like to be unconscious. Experience requires consciousness. You cannot remember forgetting something. Successful forgetting leaves no trace in memory. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness necessarily involves such paradoxical limitations. The very nature of awareness as the knowing capacity means it cannot fully know itself as an object. Dreams demonstrate consciousness addressing its own paradoxes. In dreams, impossible scenarios become momentarily plausible. You can be simultaneously observer and observed, can experience being someone else, can witness yourself from outside. As sleep approaches, you approach one of consciousness's fundamental paradoxes. The transition between waking and sleeping can never be directly experienced. The very attempt to observe the transition prevents what it attempts to witness, revealing how consciousness involves inherent limitations that no amount of introspective skill can overcome. The paradoxical twins. A girl is born on December 28th, yet her birthday is always in the summer. How is this possible? She lives in the southern hemisphere, where December falls during summer. This geographical perspective shift reminds us how concepts like summer depend on reference frames rather than absolute properties. What constitutes summer reverses across hemispheres, demonstrating how context determines meaning. Consciousness similarly depends on reference frames. The identical physical sensation feels pleasant or unpleasant, depending on surrounding circumstances. The same visual input generates different perceptions, depending on expectations and attention. Even fundamental categories like space and time shift across conscious states. Dreams manipulate spatial and temporal references, creating experiences impossible in waking life. Spaces that morph, time that dilates or compresses, impossible geometries that nevertheless feel experientially coherent. Some philosophical traditions suggest consciousness itself might represent a particular reference frame rather than an entity or process. From this perspective, awareness isn't something that exists within reality, but a particular way of framing reality. A perspective that creates the subject-object distinction we experience as fundamental. Different states of consciousness might represent different reference frames rather than different contents within the same framework. As sleep approaches, your reference frame gradually shifts. The practical, physically constrained framework of waking consciousness transforms into the more fluid framework of dream consciousness, where conventional references to time, space, identity, and causality function differently. This transition reveals how consciousness always operates within reference frames that vary across states, rather than representing reality within a single, fixed framework. The eternal observer. What witnesses all yet participates in nothing, exists everywhere yet occupies nowhere, knows everything yet learns nothing. Consciousness itself presents the ultimate riddle. As we conclude this journey through unsolvable puzzles, consider how your awareness embodies the greatest mystery of all. The very experience reading these words somehow emerges from electrochemical activity in your brain, yet feels categorically different from physical processes. Neuroscience maps neural correlates of consciousness with increasing precision, identifying brain regions and activity patterns associated with awareness. Yet the explanatory gap remains. How does neural firing translate into subjective experience? Why does it feel like something to be you? Some philosophers suggest consciousness might be fundamental rather than emergent. Perhaps experience represents an intrinsic aspect of reality alongside physical properties. Others propose consciousness emerges from information integration, complex feedback loops, or global availability of neural information. Quantum theories suggest consciousness might involve quantum processes that connect mind to the fundamental indeterminacy of reality. Despite centuries of investigation across disciplines, consciousness remains simultaneously our most intimate knowledge and our deepest puzzle. As sleep finally approaches and your awareness prepares for its nightly transformation, remember that you embody the universe's most profound mystery. The boundary between known and unknown, between science and mystery, doesn't lie in distant galaxies or subatomic particles, but in the very experience of being that witnesses these words, contemplates these riddles, and now gently releases into the equally enigmatic realm of dreams.